Welcome back, my friend. If this story keeps you company tonight, a like helps more than you'd think. It's how these stories find their way to more people like you. Now let's get into it. Tonight's first story comes from the high country of western North Carolina, from a ranger district where the fog settles into the hollows like it belongs there. It's told to us by the man who lived it, in his own words. He asked that we use his real first name and change nothing else. This is Ranger Caleb Voss Detot. My name is Caleb Voss, and for 11 years I worked as a law enforcement ranger in the Pisgah Ranger District, up in the mountains of western North Carolina. Most of what I did out there was ordinary. I checked permits. I broke up illegal campfires during burn bans. I hauled college kids off cliff edges they had no business climbing in the first place. In 11 years, I thought I had seen every version of trouble those woods could offer a person. I was wrong about that. This is the story of the night that proved it. It started on a Tuesday evening in October, the kind of evening where the light goes thin and gray around 5 o'clock, and the temperature drops fast once the sun slips behind the ridgeline. I was closing out paperwork at the ranger station when the call came in. A hiker named Marcus Feld had failed to check in with his sister. He'd told her he was doing a 2-day solo trip on a section of trail near Shining Rock, and that he'd call her from the trailhead parking lot the moment he got back down. He hadn't called. He wasn't answering his phone. His car was still sitting in the trailhead lot, and according to a passing trail crew, it had been sitting there for at least one full day past when he said he'd be out. That's not automatically an emergency. People lose track of time in the backcountry all the time. But his sister had a bad feeling. The kind rangers learn to take seriously, because more often than any of us would like, that feeling turns out to be right. And the forecast made the whole thing worse. A cold front was dropping down out of the north, and by midnight we were expecting hard rain, falling temperatures, and wind gusts strong enough to bring down dead trees. If Marcus Feld was hurt out there, or turned around, that storm was going to take a bad situation and make it fatal, fast. So he mobilized. Me, another ranger named Denise Ashworth, and 2 volunteers from the local search and rescue squad. I want to say something about Denise here, because she matters to this story. Denise had been with the district about 4 years by that point, and she was, without question, the most level-headed person I worked with. She didn't scare easily, and she didn't believe in anything she couldn't explain with a flashlight and a set of tracks on the ground. I respected that about her, most of the time. On this particular night, it put us at odds, and I still think about that. We started up the trail a little after 7 that evening, working off the last known coordinates from Marcus's car and a rough sense of his planned loop, based on a note he'd left with his sister. The first stretch was uneventful. Owls calling somewhere off to the north. The occasional rustle of something small working through the leaf litter. My headlamp beam picking out wet bark. Spiderwebs. The pale undersides of rhododendron leaves, turned up by the wind. Denise split the 2 volunteers off to cover a parallel ridge, and the 2 of us pushed on toward a hollow that Marcus's planned route would have taken him through on his way to his second campsite. About 40 minutes in, I noticed the quiet. It's hard to explain this to somebody who hasn't spent real time in the woods, but a healthy forest is never actually silent. There's always something. Insects. Wind moving through branches. Small animals shifting in the brush. Even in October, even at night, there's a baseline hum of life going on around you that you stop noticing until it's gone. And right around the time we dropped down into that hollow, it was gone. Completely. I stopped walking. Denise noticed, and stopped too. "You hear that?" I asked her. "Hear what?" she said, which was, of course, the point. I told her it felt wrong. She told me it was probably a temperature drop pushing the insects down for the night, or a predator that had passed through recently and spooked everything quiet ahead of it. Both of those are real things that happen in these mountains. I want to be fair to her explanation because it wasn't a foolish one. It was the correct, rational, experienced ranger answer. It just turned out to be wrong. We kept moving through the hollow, and maybe 10 minutes later, my flashlight caught something off the trail that made both of us stop again. There was a small clearing, maybe 20 feet across, and scattered through it were the remains of at least 4 different animals. A rabbit. What was left of a raccoon. 2 birds, one of them a wild turkey. I want to be careful about how I describe this, because it wasn't what you'd expect from a kill site. There was no blood trail leading in or out. No drag marks. No paw prints in the soft dirt around the edges, and that dirt was soft enough that even a light footstep should have left a clean mark. The bodies were laid out in a loose spiral, each one facing inward toward the center of the clearing where there was nothing at all. Just bare ground. Denise crouched next to the raccoon and studied it for a long moment before she stood back up. "Coyotes," she said. "Maybe a bobcat catching food. They stash kills sometimes, drag them to a clear spot." "In a spiral," I said. "All facing in." "Coincidence," she said. "Or I'm wrong about the shape and it's just how the ground slopes here." I didn't believe that, and I don't think some part of her did either. But we had a missing hiker and a storm bearing down, and neither of us had the luxury of standing in a clearing arguing about animal behavior. We took a few photos on our department phones, marked the location on our GPS units, and kept moving. Denise radioed it into the second team, keeping her voice flat and factual as she described what we'd found. She left the spiral out of the report entirely. I'm going to jump ahead for a moment because I don't want to leave this hanging the way it hung for me for weeks afterward. When our full team came back through that same hollow 2 days later, in daylight, with the weather clear, the clearing was empty. No remains at all. Not scattered, not dragged off into the brush, not even a scrap of bone or feather left in the leaf litter. I asked an old ranger named Wrangell Pruitt about it later, because if anyone in that district had an answer, it was him. Wrangell had worked those mountains for almost 30 years before he retired, and people still called him when something strange came out of them. He explained the missing remains without much drama at all. A hard rain, the kind we got that same night, moving fast down an exposed slope with nothing to slow it, can scour a small clearing down to bare dirt in a matter of hours, especially something as light as a rabbit or a bird. Whatever the rain didn't wash into the drainage below, the local scavengers would have finished off well before we came back through. It wasn't a mystery. It was weather and time doing ordinary work, fast diet. What Wrangell didn't have an ordinary answer for was the spiral, and the way every one of those animals had been turned to face the same empty center. He told me he'd seen that particular arrangement exactly twice before in his career, both times tied to somebody going missing in that same stretch of forest. He had an old phrase for it. One he said he picked up early in his career from a Cherokee tracker he'd worked alongside for a season, though he was honest that he couldn't tell me exactly what it meant beyond how that one man had used it. He called it clearinghouse. He said it the way you'd describe something announcing that it had already claimed the ground before anyone else arrived. I'm not asking you to take that as fact. I'm only telling you what he told me because it's the only explanation I've ever gotten, and because of what happened a few hours after Denise, and I found that clearing. Back to the timeline. It was close to 9 that evening when the storm arrived early, faster than forecast, and hit that ridge line hard. Rain first, then wind strong enough to bring a dead limb down about 30 feet from where Denise and I were standing. Our radios started cutting in and out. The second team called to say they were pulling back to the trailhead, that pushing forward with no visibility, and that kind of wind was too dangerous to justify, and that was the right call for them to make. Denise wanted the two of us to pull back as well. I didn't. I want to be honest about why, because it wasn't bravery. It was the quiet, and the spiral, and a feeling I couldn't shake that Marcus Feld didn't have much time left. Storm, or no storm. I told Denise to get the volunteers down safe, and that I was going to push another half-mile toward the last known campsite marker on his planned route before turning back myself. She argued with me, and she was right to. She pointed out correctly that I was violating about 4 different protocols by continuing alone in that weather. I told her I'd radio in every 15 minutes. She didn't like it, but she also knew that once I'd made up my mind about something, arguing further just burned time neither of us had. She headed down the mountain with the others. I was alone in that forest for the rest of that night, and this is the part of the story I have never managed to tell the same way twice, because I still don't fully understand what happened. The half-mile took me almost an hour in that wind. I found the campsite marker, an old fire ring listed on Marcus's route, but no tent, no gear, no sign that he'd ever made it that far. By then, the storm had made travel back down genuinely more dangerous than staying put, and my radio had dropped to bursts of static I couldn't make words out of. I made the call every ranger is trained to make in that situation. I found a defensible spot against a rock outcrop, got a fire going despite wet wood, which took me the better part of 30 minutes and most of the dry tinder in my pack, and settled in to wait out the worst of the storm before pushing on at first light. God! That fire mattered more than warmth that night, and I wanted to explain why, because it connects to something Wrangell told me only after I described what happened next. Somewhere around midnight, in a lull between wind gusts, I heard my name. Not shouted. Not panicked, the way you'd expect from someone lost and calling out for help. Just said clearly, in a calm and ordinary voice, the way a colleague might say it to get your attention across a room. Caleb. I stood up so fast I nearly put my boot into the fire. I called back the way anyone would, asking who was there, telling them I was a ranger and I could help. Nothing answered. I told myself it was the wind moving through the gaps in that rock outcrop, doing something strange with the sound, because that does happen in mountain terrain. Wind funneling through narrow gaps and hollow spaces can produce sounds that mimic a human voice with startling accuracy. I have heard that explanation from other rangers more than once over the years, and I still believe it accounts for a great many strange sounds people report in the backcountry. It happened again about 20 minutes later. Same tone. Same rough distance somewhere off to my left, just past the edge of the firelight. Caleb. Dot. And underneath it that time, very faint, I heard something else. A second voice, further out, saying a different name. Marcus. Dot. Just once. That's the moment I understood. On some level, I still can't fully explain to myself even now. That answering was the wrong move. I want to be careful about how I say this, because I don't have a tidy theory to offer you. I only know that every instinct I had, the same instincts that had kept me alive in that backcountry for 11 years, was telling me to stay silent, and I listened to it. I fed the fire. I sat facing outward, my back against the rock, and I didn't answer. Not once, for the rest of that night. Not when my name came again, closer that time. Not when it came a 4th time, and then a 5th, spaced out unevenly, sometimes 10 minutes apart, once what felt like almost an hour. Not at the one very bad moment, close to 3 in the morning, when it stopped sounding quite like my own voice being copied back to me, and started sounding like something else entirely. Something with the exact shape of my name, and none of the warmth a person would ever put into saying it. Wrangell Pruitt, when I told him this part weeks later, sitting across from him at his kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee going cold between us, went quiet for a moment before he answered. Then he told me about the 2 other cases he'd mentioned, the ones tied to the spiral. In both, he said, the missing person had eventually turned up alive within a day of the sighting. and in both the survivor had described almost exactly what I was describing to him. A voice using their name, patient, waiting just outside the firelight for an answer that never came. He told me there was an old name for that too, something he'd picked up secondhand from people he trusted but couldn't fully vouch for himself, and he chose not to repeat it to me, because he said he didn't see the use in handing out a word he couldn't stand fully behind. What he did tell me twice, like it mattered to him that I understood it clearly, was this: the fire matters, and the silence matters more. You do not answer. Not your own name, not anyone else's, no matter how badly you want to help. I don't know how long that night actually lasted. It felt considerably longer than any other night I have spent in those mountains, storm or no storm. But eventually the wind died down, the rain thinned to a drizzle, and gray lights started climbing over the ridge. And somewhere in that gray light, the voice stopped. At first light, I broke camp and started moving, following a hunch more than any real trail, downslope toward a rock shelter I knew from years of working that district. A spot hikers sometimes used in bad weather because it offered decent cover. I found Marcus Feld there, alive, sitting upright against the rock wall with his knees pulled to his chest and his pack still on his back. He was cold, badly dehydrated, and clearly shaken, but physically he was largely fine. No injuries beyond scrapes he could explain clearly from a fall early on the first day of his trip, well before any of this started. What he couldn't explain to me was the previous night. He remembered making camp near dusk. He remembered hearing something moving close by that he'd assumed was a bear, and deciding to stay dead quiet inside his tent. And then his next clear memory was full daylight, my flashlight in his eyes, and my voice telling him he was safe. Everything between those 2 points, roughly 6 hours by any reasonable estimate, was simply gone. Not fragmented, not dreamlike. Gone, the way a chapter is gone from a book somebody tore out before you got to read it. Was somebody calling my name, he asked me. Once we were moving, once he'd had water and a granola bar, and enough of his voice back to ask the question at all. I told him I honestly didn't know. That was the truth. I still don't. We got him out. He recovered fully, physically, within about 2 weeks. Though the last I heard from his sister, he still won't hike alone, and I don't blame him one bit. Denise met us at the trailhead. I told her everything I'd heard that night, all of it, exactly the way I've told it to you. I expected her to hand me one of her rational explanations, wind through rock, exhaustion playing tricks on a tired mind. And honestly, some of that probably did play some part in it. But she didn't argue with me the way I expected her to. She told me that while she and the volunteers were making their way down through the storm, she'd heard something too. Off in the trees to their side, calling out one of the volunteers' names, clear as anything, in a lull, in the wind. She hadn't said a word to anyone about it at the time. She'd just told the volunteer to keep walking, and hadn't looked back. That was the closest Denise Ashworth ever came, in all the years I worked with her afterward, to admitting that something out there didn't have a simple explanation. She never fully came around, and I respect that about her. I think some people need the rational answer more than they need the true one, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's probably the healthier way to live. As for me, I put in for a transfer about 3 months later to a different section of the district, further south, away from that particular ridgeline. Nobody questioned it. Rangers move around for all kinds of reasons, and I never had to explain mine to anybody who didn't already understand. I still think about that spiral sometimes, and about Wendell Pruitt's old phrase, clearing house, and about the fact that whatever was out there that night knew my name before I ever gave it a reason to. I don't have an answer for that. I only have the rule Wendell gave me, the one I've followed every single time I've been alone in those woods since, and the one I'd pass on to anybody who spends real time in wild country, ranger or not. If something calls your name out there after dark, and you never told it who you were, do not answer. Ranger Voss made it out of Pisgah with his life, but not every ranger's story ends the same way. Our next story comes from deep in the Atchafalaya Basin in Louisiana, where the water keeps its own kind of memory. It's told to us by the one officer who lived to tell it. My name is Remy Doucet. I've worked as an enforcement agent for the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries for a long time now, running patrol out of a station on the edge of the Atchafalaya Basin. It's been many years since the events I'm about to describe, and I still take my boat out through those same channels most weeks for work. There are nights when the moon's full and the water's flat calm that I catch myself cutting the engine early just to listen for something I hope never answers back. For those of you who've never spent time in a place like this, the basin isn't really one swamp. It's hundreds of miles of interconnected bayous, lakes, and flooded cypress forest, the largest river swamped in the country, and it changes character depending on the season, the rainfall upriver, even the time of day. In summer, it can feel almost peaceful. Herons wading in the shallows, dragonflies working the surface, sunlight coming down in broken pieces through the canopy. In late autumn and winter, when the water's high and the fog sits heavy in the mornings, it turns into something else entirely, something older feeling. And anybody who tells you they've never once felt watched out there, alone in a boat, on a gray morning with the mist still hanging over the water, either hasn't spent enough time in it or isn't being honest with themselves. I want to tell you about my partner, a man named Auguste Fontenot, and about the last season we ever worked together. Before I get into what happened, I should say a little about myself too, since I'm the one telling this. I came to this job a bit later than most, after a handful of years working offshore on a supply boat out of Morgan City, tired of the schedule and wanting something that kept me closer to home. I'd never trapped or hunted the basin the way August had, but I loved the water enough that the transition felt natural. And within a couple of seasons I could hold my own out there, even if I never matched August's instinct for it. I say all this because I want you to understand that I wasn't a man prone to seeing things that weren't there. I'd spent years around rough water and rougher weather, and I trusted my own judgment about what was real and what wasn't. That trust took a serious hit the season I'm about to describe, and it's never fully come back. Not completely, not even now. August and I had been partnered for going on 6 years by the time this happened. And I should say up front that basin work builds a kind of trust you don't get in a lot of other jobs. Out there, it's just you and one other person, in a flat-bottom boat, moving through channels that all look the same to anybody who hasn't spent a lifetime learning them. There's a stretch north of our station where the water braids into a dozen near-identical passages through the cypress. No signage, no landmarks a stranger could read. And the first time I ever ran that stretch alone as a rookie, I got turned around so badly, it took me most of an afternoon to find my way back out. August never once got lost out there in his life. You learn to trust the person next to you completely, because there isn't anybody else close enough to help if something goes wrong. And because in a boat that size, in water that deep, a mistake doesn't give you much room to correct it. August grew up in the basin. His people had trapped and fished those waters for generations before he ever put on a uniform, going back, by his own account, to a great-great-grandfather who'd worked that same water with a pirogue and a cane pole. He knew that swamp the way most people know their own house in the dark, without needing to think about it. I remember one call, a couple of years before any of this started, when a fishing boat went down in a bad squall, well after dark. 2 people in the water. No visibility, radio contact spotty at best. August found them in under 20 minutes, navigating channels I couldn't even see clearly with a spotlight, working purely off memory and the sound of the current against the hull. If you'd told me back then that the basin would eventually take him instead of protect him, I'd have told you that you didn't know Auguste Fontenot, and I'd have meant it with everything in me. Outside of work, August was the kind of man who kept a photo of his daughter taped inside the console of our patrol boat. A school picture with a gap-toothed smile, and he'd tap it every single morning before we shoved off. A habit so automatic I don't think he even noticed he was doing it anymore. He used to tease me about being a city transplant, even though I'd grown up less than an hour from the basin myself, just because I hadn't grown up on the water the way he had. We spent more hours together in that boat than most married couples spend in a house. 6 years of long silences and short jokes and the particular kind of comfortable quiet that only comes from trusting somebody completely. I think about that photo taped inside the console more than almost anything else from that season, because it was still there, untouched, the morning after, when I finally brought the boat back in and alone. The trouble started small, the way it usually does. We ran a regular circuit checking trot lines and crawfish traps for tag violations, keeping an eye out for illegal nutria and gator poaching. The ordinary work of the job. About 3 weeks before everything happened, on a Tuesday patrol, we started finding torn-up trot lines on one particular stretch of channel. Out past a bend the old-timers called Broussard's Cut. Not just pulled loose, the way lines get when a big gator rolls through one chasing bait. Shredded. Line snapped clean in multiple places along its length, hooks bent flat, like something had gone through the whole run with real force and real intention, working methodically down the line rather than just crashing through it once. A week after that, on a Thursday, we found claw marks on the hull of our own patrol boat. 4 parallel gouges dragged along one side, deep enough to catch a fingernail in. August ran his thumb along them and didn't say much. I remember him telling me a big bull gator could maybe leave marks like that if it came up hard against the aluminum defending territory, but even as he said it, I could tell he didn't fully believe it himself. The spacing was wrong for a gator. Too wide, too even, more like fingers than teeth, and set at a height that would have meant something rearing up out of the water rather than rolling against the hull the way a gator naturally would. Then, about 4 days before everything happened, we found a trap line where every single trap had been pulled up onto the bank and opened. The catch gone from each one, but nothing scattered, nothing dragged off through the mud the way a raccoon or an otter working a trap line usually leaves a mess behind. Each trap had been set back down afterward, closed again, arranged in a neat row along the bank instead of left, where we originally staked them in the water, spaced almost evenly, like somebody had taken the time to line them up before moving on. August crouched down and ran his hand along the row without touching any of the traps directly, counting them out loud under his breath. 6 in total, all accounted for, all empty, all closed. He stood looking at that row of empty traps for a long moment before he said quietly that he didn't like it, and August wasn't a man who said things like that easily. I asked him what exactly he thought had done it, half expecting one of his usual dry jokes, and he just shook his head and said he didn't know, and that not knowing was the part bothering him most. There was a bait shop and dock down near the launch where an old trapper named Elias Broussard still spent most of his days, mending nets and telling stories to anybody who'd sit still long enough to listen. His shop smelling permanently of diesel and cut bait and the particular mustiness of nets that never fully dried between uses. Shelves crowded with hooks and line and faded photographs of fish, caught decades before either August or Weir. His family was the same Broussard the cutout there was named after, generations back. When we mentioned the torn lines and the marks on the hull, expecting maybe a laugh, he didn't laugh at all. He set down the net he'd been mending, wiped his hands on his pants, and looked at both of us for a good long moment before he said anything. He asked us, very plainly, if we'd seen anything standing upright out there that didn't belong standing upright. We told him no, not yet. He told us that was good, and that if we ever did, we were not to go chasing it. And we were not to go quiet either. He said the old families in that basin had a name for what moved through the deep channel sometimes. especially in years when the water ran high and strange. Years like this one had been, with 2 hurricanes pushing brackish water further up into the freshwater channels than anybody could remember happening before. He called it the Rougarou. I know some of you watching have heard that word before, and some of you probably grew up with grandparents who used it to keep children close to the porch after dark. Eli told us 2 things that night that I've never forgotten. He said the Rougarou hates light and hates loud, sudden noise, and that both of those things will drive it off if you're caught out with it. And he said if you ever do see it face to face, you keep that to yourself for a full year and a day, or the thing you saw has a way of finding its way onto you next, passing from person to person the way a debt gets passed, until somebody finally holds their silence long enough to end it. I didn't put much stock in that second part at the time. I think about it more than I'd like to admit now, and I've kept my own silence about certain details of that night for a lot longer than a year and a day, though I'm choosing to break it here, for reasons that will make sense by the end of this. Eli told us that night about his own father's encounter, back when Eli himself was barely old enough to remember it clearly. A story about a winter when the traps came up empty for 2 straight weeks, despite plenty of sign in the mud, and how his father had finally seen something crouched at the water's edge one evening, upright, watching the camp from maybe 30 yards off, and how his father hadn't run, hadn't shouted, had simply... Eli said his father always credited the light for saving them that winter, and that he'd never once doubted the story growing up, because his father wasn't a man given to exaggeration about anything else in his life, and had no reason to start with that. Before we left the dock that evening, Eli walked us down to a mud bank near Broussard's Cut, and showed us something he said his own father used to leave out there, a small bundle of bone and heron feather, bound up with vine and hung from a low cypress knee, meant as an old kind of warning marker, a way of telling anything that passed through that this was watched ground, that somebody out here knew the old rules and hadn't forgotten. He tied a fresh one himself while we stood there, more out of habit than real hope, he told us, working the vine with hands that clearly hadn't lost the skill despite his age, and hung it from the knee. I went back out to that same spot 2 days later on an unrelated patrol, and it was gone. No vine, no feather, nothing hanging from that cypress knee at all. I want to be honest that this looked at first like something had torn it down deliberately. The real explanation is a lot less dramatic, and I think it matters to say it plainly. The water in that part of the basin can rise close to a foot overnight after heavy rain upriver, and that particular mud bank sits low, lower than most of the surrounding ground. By the time I came back through, the whole bank was underwater, knee and all, submerged well past where that marker had been hanging. Whatever became of that little bundle, the basin swallowed it the same way it swallows everything else out there eventually. I'm not telling you something supernatural took it. I'm telling you the water almost certainly did, because that's the far more likely explanation, and I don't want to leave you wondering about it the way I used to wonder about smaller things before I learned how fast that basin can change on you. I did mention the torn lines and the claw marks to Sheriff Earl Guidry, whose parish bordered part of our patrol territory, mostly because he'd radioed in about a missing pirogue that same week, an elderly man's boat found drifting empty near a fishing camp with no sign of the owner. A case that eventually resolved itself when the man turned up 2 counties over having simply forgotten where he'd tied up. Embarrassed and unharmed. Earl was a good sheriff, and I want to be fair to him, because he wasn't dismissive out of laziness. He'd worked that parish for close to 20 years and had a rational answer for almost everything that came out of the basin, and most of the time, his rational answers were the correct ones, which is exactly why people trusted him as much as they did. We were standing on his dock when I brought it up, watching a couple of teenagers try to back a boat trailer down the ramp badly enough that Earl eventually walked over to help without being asked. When he came back, I told him about the trot lines and the hull. He leaned against a piling, arms crossed, and told me it was gator season, that a big male gator defending territory could tear a trot line apart and scar a hull without much trouble at all, and that Elie Broussard had been telling Rougarou stories at that dock since before Earl was born, entertaining tourists more than warning agents who ought to know better. My grandmother used to tell me the same stories to keep me from wandering off after dark, he said, laughing a little. Worked, too. I still don't much like being out there past sundown, and it's got nothing to do with any monster. He wasn't cruel about it. He just genuinely believed it, and honestly, most days, so did I. We even laughed about it a little, standing on his dock, the two of us agreeing that swamp stories tended to grow taller the closer you got to Halloween. That confidence lasted until the night August and I went out to stake out a stretch of channel where somebody had been running unlicensed trot lines after dark. Poaching activity we'd been trying to catch for weeks. Time to a tip that our poacher favored a particular bend past Broussard's cut on nights with a bit of moonlight to work by. It was a warm night, heavy with fog low over the water the way the basin gets sometimes, when the temperature drops just enough after a hot day. The kind of fog that sits in patches rather than blanketing everything evenly. So you'd pass through a clear stretch and then, without warning, into something thick enough to swallow your own spotlight beam. We cut the engine and drifted, running dark, the way you do on a stakeout, waiting to catch our poacher in the act. August had brought coffee in an old dented thermos, and we passed it back and forth in silence for the first hour. Both of us more alert than usual after everything we'd found over the past few weeks, though neither of us said as much out loud. At one point he asked me, half joking, whether I'd brought my own flashlight along in case Ellie's advice turned out to matter. And I told him I had, mostly to humor him. And he laughed and said that was probably smart, in a tone that made it hard to tell how much of the joke he actually meant. About 2 hours in, with no sign of anybody, the outboard motor wouldn't turn over when August tried to reposition us further into the channel. Flooded, he figured, or fouled on something in the water, maybe a stray line wrapped around the prop. He climbed toward the stern to work on it while I held the spotlight ready, more out of habit than any real expectation of needing it. I noticed the fog thickening around us first, curling in off the tree line in a way that didn't match the direction of what little breeze there was. And then I noticed how loud the silence under it felt. Not the total absence of sound the way I'd later hear that Caleb Voss described from his own night in those Carolina mountains, but a narrowing of it. Every normal basin noise. The frogs, the insects, the distant grunt of a gator somewhere off in the mud. That's when I heard something moving in the water off to our left, closer to the tree line than open channel. A heavy, deliberate movement. Not the quick, startled splash of something fleeing, but something slower. More like wading than swimming, the kind of movement that made me think, even before I could see anything, of something walking rather than something purely at home in the water. At first I told myself it was a gator, because that's what you tell yourself out there. Because 99 times out of 100, that's exactly what it is. But gators don't usually surface the way this did, rising up higher than a gator's back has any business rising. And when I swung the spotlight over what caught the light for just a second before it dropped back below the surface, had eyes set too high and too far apart to belong to anything I could name, catching that beam back at me in a flat yellow shine that didn't look animal and didn't look human either for just a moment, and I could make out the suggestion of shoulders, Brad and Rock. I don't fully remember deciding to do it. I just remember doing it. I kept that spotlight locked on the water where it had gone under, and I started beating the flat of a boat paddle against the aluminum hull as hard and as fast as I could, the way you'd bang a pot to scare something off a camp at night. Except I put everything I had into it, my arm burning within seconds. August was shouting too, I think, though I honestly couldn't tell you what either of us was saying. All I remember with any clarity is the light, and the noise, and how loud my own heartbeat sounded underneath both of them, drowning out even the sound of the paddle against the hull. It surfaced again, closer that time, close enough that I felt spray hit the side of the boat, and for one terrible second I saw it clearly enough to know I never wanted to see it again, tall and dark and upright in a way that made the shape of it wrong for the water it was standing in, before it dropped back under and the water went still. I actually believed in that pause, chest heaving, arms shaking around the paddle, that we'd driven it off for good, and that August and I were about to have a story to tell that nobody at the station would ever fully believe. It came a third time, and that's the part I still can't get past. It surfaced almost directly beneath the stern, close enough to rock the boat hard enough that I had to grab the gunwale to keep my footing. And I swung the light and beat the hull even harder, screaming at it now. No words, just noise, throat raw. And it went back under again. And the boat settled, and the fog seemed to thin just slightly, like something had finally decided to leave. I turned around to tell August we'd done it, that we'd actually driven it off, and August wasn't in the boat. I want to be as honest as I can about what I know and don't know from that point on, because I've turned this over more times than I can count in the years since. I never heard a splash. I never heard him call out, not my name, not anything. He was there when I was banging on that hull with everything in me, close enough that our shoulders had bumped together at one point. And then I turned around, and the stern of that boat was empty, and the water around us was flat and undisturbed, like nothing had ever touched it at all. Like the boat itself had simply forgotten he'd ever been standing there. We searched that basin for 11 straight days. Sheriff Guidry ran his own boats alongside ours, and I want to say clearly that he searched as hard as anybody, harder maybe, because I think some part of what happened to August needled at the confidence he'd had about all of it before that night. Divers went down in every stretch of channel we could reasonably access, working in pairs with lines tied to the boats above them, because visibility below the surface out there is close to nothing most days, a few inches at best, everything done by feel. Dogs worked the banks for a mile in every direction, handlers wading through mud up to their knees, and on the fourth day a state police helicopter ran grid patterns overhead for the better part of an afternoon before the weather closed back in and grounded them. We never found him. Not his body, not his equipment, not so much as a boot in the mud. People who don't know that basin sometimes ask how a grown man could disappear that completely without a single trace turning up. And the honest answer is that the Atchafalaya is very good at swallowing things whole. Current, mud, submerged brush, alligators. It's a landscape built to erase evidence even without anything unnatural helping it along. And every experienced search and rescue diver who worked those 11 days told me the same thing. That a body could go down into that mud and simply never come back up. Not ever, not even years later. I believe that's most likely exactly what happened to August. I want that to be the whole truth of it, because it would be so much easier to carry if it was, and some nights I managed to convince myself that it is. On the 12th day, the official search was scaled back to occasional patrols rather than a dedicated effort, which is standard procedure, and which felt at the time like the whole world quietly agreeing to move on before I was anywhere close to ready to. I still don't fully believe it's the whole truth, and I don't think Sheriff Guidry does either, even though neither of us has ever said that to each other directly. Not once in all the years since, not even the time we ran into each other at a funeral 2 winters back, and stood together outside for a long while without either of us bringing it up at all. August's wife held a memorial for him about a month after the search was called off, without a body, which is its own particular kind of hard for a family to sit through. I stood in the back of that church and watched his daughter, the same gap-toothed girl from the photo taped inside our boat's console, now several years older, read a short poem she'd written about her father. And I remember thinking that whatever explanation I eventually settled on for that night, rational or otherwise, it was never going to matter to her nearly as much as the simple fact that he wasn't. I still send a card every year around the holidays, and every year I debate telling her the truth of it. And every year I decide the kindest thing I can do is let her keep the version of the story where the water simply took her father, quick and clean, rather than whatever the real version might be. Elie Broussard passed away some years back now, but before he did, I went and sat with him one more time and told him everything. The eyes, the light, the noise, all of it. breaking whatever remained of my own silence a little early, because I needed somebody who might actually understand to hear it. He listened without interrupting, the way he always did, working a piece of net between his hands the whole time out of old habit. And when I finished, he just nodded slowly and told me I'd done the one thing that might have saved my own life that night, driving it off with the light and the noise the way his father had taught him, the way his father's father had taught him before that. He didn't have an answer for August. He told me some nights the basin simply decides to keep something, and there's no bargaining with that, and no explaining it either, no matter how many years you spend trying, no matter how many prayers you say over the water afterward. I still work that same stretch of the basin today. I still run my patrols past Broussard's Cut, and most nights, it's exactly what it should be. Water and cypress and the ordinary sounds of the swamp, doing what they've always done. Herons startling up out of the reeds, gators grunting somewhere off in the dark, the whole place humming along the way it's supposed to. I've trained 3 different partners since August, good agents, all of them, and I've never told any of them the full story. Only the parts that matter practically, keep a spotlight charged, keep something loud within reach. Don't ever assume it's just a gator until you've had a clear, close look. A couple of them have asked why I'm so particular about it, more particular than the job strictly requires, and I've always found some other reason to give them, weather, liability, an old habit from a mentor who drilled it into me early. I've never once told the real reason, and I don't know that I ever will, to anybody but the people watching this now. But on full moon nights, when the fog sits low and the water goes still the way it did that night, I sometimes cut my engine early and just sit with the spotlight resting in my lap, ready, listening for something out past the tree line. Every year, around the anniversary, I tie a bundle of my own now, bone and heron feather bound with vine, the way Ellie showed us, and hang it from that same low cypress knee at Broussard's Cut. And every year, sooner or later, the water rises and takes it. And I tell myself that's just the basin doing what the basin does. And most days, I believe it. Some nights, I swear I hear it call out, low, from somewhere back in the trees, in a voice that almost sounds like it's trying to shape itself into a name I'd know. Patient in a way that never quite stops being unsettling no matter how many years pass between one full moon and the next. I've never once answered it. I don't intend to start now, and if you ever find yourself out on water like that, at night, with fog low and something calling from the trees in a voice that almost fits, I hope you remember the light and the noise, and I hope you remember not to answer either. Agent Doucet still works those bayous today. The light and the noise always within reach if he ever needs them again. Our third story tonight takes us to the other side of the country, into the rain-soaked wilderness of Washington State's Olympic Peninsula, where not every mystery in the woods wears a recognizable face. Sometimes it's simply a person who never came home and a handful of questions that were never fully answered. This story is told to us by the ranger who spent years refusing to let that case go cold. This is Ranger Nora Kessler. My name is Nora Kessler, and I've spent most of my career as a ranger in the backcountry of Olympic National Park, on the western side, where the rainforest gets more annual rainfall than almost anywhere else in the country, and the moss grows so thick on the maples that entire trees look upholstered in green. People who visit for a weekend tend to describe it as beautiful, and it is. But people who work in it for years learn a different word for it too. Old. Not old in the sense of ancient trees, though we have plenty of those, but old in the sense that the forest has swallowed more than the tourists ever hear about, and it doesn't give any of it back easily. I came to this job from a background in wildlife biology, not law enforcement, which is a fairly common path into ranger work, but one that shapes how you approach a mystery differently than someone who came up through a police academy. I was trained to look for patterns, to distrust a single data point and wait for corroboration, to assume the mundane explanation until the evidence genuinely ruled it out. That training served me well for most of my career. It served me less well the year I finally let myself follow a hunch that never had quite enough evidence behind it to justify the time I spent on it. And it cost me more sleep than any other case I've ever worked. This is the story of a woman named Sadie Lindqvist, and of a long dormant case file that sat unsolved in our small district office for years, before I finally found the thread that let me pull it open again, one small piece at a time. Sadie disappeared on a solo backpacking trip into the Haw rainforest backcountry, on a permit she'd filed for a 5-day loop that would have taken her up past the river drainages and back down through old-growth forest most visitors never see. She was experienced. That matters, because in a lot of these stories, the missing person is somebody who wandered in over their head, unprepared, and the tragedy, while real, isn't much of a mystery. Sadie wasn't that. She'd done backcountry trips like this one for years, going back to college, where friends of hers who I eventually tracked down and spoke with described her as the kind of hiker who read weather reports twice and packed the same careful checklist every single time, never cutting corners on the boring, unglamorous parts of trip preparation that keep people alive out there. She worked as a school teacher during the year and saved her longer solo trips for summer break, treating them, by every account I gathered, as something closer to a spiritual practice than a hobby. She'd filed her route correctly. She'd told her roommate exactly when to expect her back, and who to call if she didn't check in, down to specifying which ranger station to contact first. When she missed her check-in by 2 full days, her roommate called it in immediately, and the original search mobilized fast and stayed in the field for close to 2 weeks before it was scaled back to periodic patrols. I wasn't on that original search. I'd transferred into the district about a year after it happened, and the case came to me the way old case files come to anybody who's willing to actually read through the box instead of leaving it in storage, which is to say, almost by accident. Our station kept a back room stacked with bankers' boxes going back decades. Unsolved permits, incident reports, the ordinary paperwork residue of a park that size. And on slow winter afternoons, when the weather kept everybody off the trails, some of us made a habit of working through them, partly out of genuine curiosity, and partly because it felt better than sitting idle. I picked hers up mostly out of curiosity, drawn in by the sheer thickness of the folder compared to most, and I ended up reading the whole thing twice before I went home that night, then again a third time the following week, unable to quite let it sit back down on the shelf where I'd found it. A few details from that original file stuck with me immediately. Searchers had found Sadie's tent about 4 days into the search, collapsed and partially covered by debris in a spot well off her stated route, along a drainage she had no obvious reason to have hiked toward given how far it sat from the loop she'd filed. Her pack was nearby, contents scattered in a pattern the original report described as consistent with scavenger activity, though the responding wildlife biologist's notes buried a few pages deeper in the file where I nearly missed them on my first read, mentioned that the scatter pattern didn't quite match what you'd expect from a bear or a cougar working through an abandoned pack, without ever explaining exactly what did match it, instead alludes, and the original team apparently never had time to... And there was a single partial boot print recovered near the tent site, photographed and cast in plaster by the original search team, that never matched any member of the search party, any known hiker permitted in that section that season, or Sadie's own boots, which were recovered separately, undamaged, still laced, sitting neatly beside the collapsed tent, like she'd stepped out of them, and simply never come back. I want to be honest that none of that, taken individually, is necessarily strange. Scatter patterns from wildlife can look inconsistent depending on which animal got there first, and how much time passed before searchers arrived. Unmatched boot prints in heavily trafficked backcountry are more common than people assume, since dozens of hikers pass through popular drainages every season without ever registering with a permit desk. But taken together, alongside 2 witness statements that didn't line up cleanly, it was enough to make me want to know more. And once I want to know more about something, I have a hard time letting it go. My chief ranger at the time, a man named Warren Tull, would probably tell you that's both my best quality and my worst one. The witness statements were the part that bothered me most once I dug into them properly. 2 separate hikers had reported seeing Sadie on the first full day of her trip, at a trailhead junction a few miles in. The first hiker, a father out with his teenage son, described her as alone, moving quickly, in good spirits, stopping only briefly to check her map before continuing on. I eventually tracked him down by phone, years after the fact, and he still remembered the encounter clearly, remembered her cheerfully warning them about a muddy washout further up the trail, remembered thinking nothing else of it at all. The second hiker, a solo backpacker heading the opposite direction, placed her at almost the exact same junction, at almost the exact same time of day, but described her as walking alongside someone else. A second figure he assumed was a hiking partner, tall, wearing dark clothing inappropriate for the terrain and the weather, who never spoke and never looked up from the trail the whole time they passed each other. When I finally reached him too, he sounded almost relieved that somebody was asking, admitted he'd always found the detail unsettling enough that he'd nearly called it in himself at the time, before deciding he'd probably just misjudged the light or the angle. Neither witness statement had been treated as more reliable than the other in the original file. Nobody had ever gone back to reconcile them, and once I had both men's fuller accounts side by side, in their own words, rather than the clipped summary in the report, the contradiction felt harder to wave away than it had on paper. When I brought this to Warren Tull and asked for authorization to spend some of my own patrol time following up on it, years after the case had technically closed, he didn't tell me I was wrong to want answers. He leaned back in his chair, took his glasses off, and rubbed his eyes the way he always did before delivering news he knew I wouldn't like. "Nora," he said, "I've read that file too. I know it doesn't sit right. But tell me honestly, what do you think 3 days in the field is going to turn up that a 2-week search with dogs and a helicopter didn't?" I didn't have a good answer for that. Not then. And he knew it. He told me something harder to argue with than any of that, which was that the department had limited resources, that reopening a cold case with no new physical evidence and 2 witness statements that could just as easily reflect ordinary human unreliability wasn't going to be a good use of either of our time, and that Sadie's family, who had been through more than enough already, didn't need to be dragged back through a search that was unlikely to produce. He wasn't cruel about it. He genuinely believed reopening it would do more harm than good, and I understood his reasoning even while I disagreed with it completely. I let it go, on paper at least, for almost a full year after that conversation. What changed things was a piece of physical evidence, small and almost embarrassingly mundane, that I found entirely by accident on a routine trail maintenance patrol nearly 3 years after Sadie disappeared. I was clearing storm debris from a footbridge crossing a side creek well downstream from where her tent had originally been found, kneeling in cold water up to my forearms trying to work a tangle of branches loose from the footings, when I noticed something metallic caught in the roots at the waterline, half buried in silt and easy to mistake for a rusted bottle cap at first. It turned out to be a wristwatch, corroded almost beyond recognition, the leather band long since rotted away, but the case itself intact enough that once I'd cleaned it carefully at the station sink that evening, working the grime out of the engraving with a soft brush and more patience than I usually have for anything, I could still make out the inscription on the back. It matched, word for word, a description Sadie's mother had given the original investigators of a graduation gift she'd bought her daughter years before the trip, a detail that had never been made public, and that I only recognized because I'd read the file closely enough, and often enough, to remember it without needing to check. I sat with that watch on my kitchen table for the better part of an evening before I called Warren Tull. I turned it over in my hands more times than I could count, thinking about the length of that creek, the distance between where her tent had been found and where I was now kneeling in the mud, and about how many separate coincidences it would take to explain a personal item, that specific washing up that far downstream on its own. I didn't sleep much that night, and I remember standing at my kitchen window well past midnight, looking out at nothing in particular, already knowing I wasn't going to let this rest a second time, even if he said no again. That watch, sitting downstream of the original search area by a considerable distance, meant one of two things. Either it had washed there over the years from somewhere near her original camp, which the creek's course made at least plausible, or Sadie herself, or whatever became of her, had moved through that drainage at some point after the search had already concluded she'd never gotten that far. I brought the watch to Warren Tull, and to his credit, once he was looking at an actual physical object instead of a theory, he authorized a limited follow-up, 3 days in the field, working with a veteran search and rescue volunteer named Hollis Byrne, who'd been part of the original search years earlier and still knew the drainage better than almost anybody alive. He didn't apologize for turning me down the year before, and I didn't ask him to. We both understood, without needing to say it out loud, that the calculation had genuinely changed, and that neither of us had been wrong given what we'd each known at the time. Hollis was somewhere in his 60s by then, built like a man who'd spent his whole life outdoors, and intended to keep doing so for as long as his knees allowed it. With a gray beard he kept trimmed close and a habit of pausing before he answered any question, like he wanted to make sure he was giving you the accurate version, rather than just the quick one. He didn't put much stock in anything he couldn't explain, but he also didn't dismiss things out of hand the way some experienced outdoorsmen do, mostly, I think, because he'd seen enough unexplained things over the decades to stay humble about how much any of us really understand about that particular stretch of forest. He'd been part of dozens of searches over the years, some that ended in relief and plenty that hadn't. And he talked about all of them with the same steady, unsentimental respect, never dramatizing, never minimizing, either. When I told him about the mismatched witness statements, he went quiet for a moment, working his jaw the way he did when he was deciding how much of something to say out loud, and told me he remembered something from the original search that had never made it into the official file, a moment when one of the search dogs, an experienced cadaver dog with years of reliable work behind it, had refused, flatly and repeatedly, to continue up a particular fork of the trail. Nobody had thought much of it at the time, he said. Dogs have off days, handlers get tired, gear malfunctions. There's always some mundane reason offered up in the moment and rarely time to chase it further during an active search. But he said he'd never quite stop thinking about it either, and that in 40 years of working with search dogs, he'd only seen that particular kind of flat, immovable refusal a small handful of times, and every one of those times had stayed with him for reasons he still couldn't fully articulate. We worked upstream from where I'd found the watch for the better part of 2 days, following the creek's course through terrain that got steadily rougher, boulders slick with algae, downed old-growth trunks we had to climb over or route entirely around, the rainforest closing in overhead until the light took on that particular green cast. That makes it hard to judge how much of the day is actually left, even with a watch on much of the day is active. Hollis moved through it at a pace that put my supposedly younger legs to shame, reading the terrain the way some people read a book, pointing out old game trails, deer bedding sites, a scattering of chanterelles he made a mental note to come back for later in the season. All of it woven into a running, easy commentary that made the miles pass faster than they had any right to. We talked in fits and starts across those 2 days, about the case, about Sadie, about other searches he'd worked, and by the second afternoon I understood why the department kept calling him back for these, decade after decade, long past when most volunteers would have retired from the work entirely. Late on the second day, in a stretch of undergrowth just above a steep ravine, Hollis stopped short, holding up a hand for quiet, and pointed to a low branch a few feet off the game trail we'd been following. Caught in it was a scrap of fabric, faded and weathered, but still clearly a piece of technical hiking material, printed in a pattern I recognized immediately from the gear photos in Sadie's case file, the kind of fabric her original permit application had listed as part of her layering system. Neither of us said much for a long moment. We photographed it from every angle we could manage in the fading light, marked the GPS coordinates twice to be certain, tagged the branch with flagging tape, and made the call to leave it in place overnight, rather than risk contaminating the site by handling it without proper evidence procedure, planning to bring a full recovery team back out first thing the next morning. It was, I remember thinking as we hiked the short distance back to our camp, the closest either of us had come to a real answer in years, and neither of us said much of anything for the rest of that walk. That night, the weather turned on us faster than either of us had planned for. A storm system that had been forecast to stay offshore pushed inland instead, and by the time we'd made it back to our camp, a modest shelter under a rock overhang about a mile downstream, the rain had gone from steady to torrential, the kind of Olympic Peninsula downpour that can drop several inches in a matter of hours and turn a quiet creek into something unrecognizable by morning. We were stuck there for the night. No question of moving in that visibility, on terrain that turns to soup the moment it takes on that much water. Hollis got a small camp stove going under the overhang for tea, more out of habit than any real need for it. And for the first couple of hours, despite the noise of the rain hammering the rocks above us, it felt almost ordinary. Two tired people waiting out weather the way you always eventually have to out there, trading quiet small talk about nothing in particular. About his grandchildren. About a fishing trip he kept meaning to take once the season allowed for it. The kind of unremarkable. I want to describe that night carefully, because it's the part of the story I still turn over more than any other. More than any other single memory from more than a decade of this work. And because, unlike some of the other stories you've heard tonight, I can't point to a single dramatic moment and say, here, this is the thing that happened. What I can tell you is that somewhere around midnight, in a lull in the rain, Hollis and I both noticed, without either of us saying anything about it at first, that something seemed to be moving along the opposite bank of the creek, keeping roughly level with our position, matching our pace whenever either of us shifted or stood to check the weather. I noticed it first as a kind of wrongness in the rhythm of the rain itself, a beat that didn't quite belong. And when I glanced over at Hollis, I saw he'd gone very still, his tea forgotten in his hands, his eyes fixed on the dark tree line across the water. Neither of us ever got a clear look at anything. The rain and the dark made that impossible. And I want to be honest that everything I'm describing could plausibly be explained by an elk moving along the bank, or a bear disturbed by the rising water and looking for higher ground. Animals do strange, erratic things during a storm like that one, and I've reminded myself of that possibility more times than I can count in the years since, usually late at night when I can't quite talk myself back down in sleep. But there was a wrongness to the way whatever it was seemed to track us, deliberate in a way that didn't match the erratic movement of an animal simply sheltering from the storm the way we were. It never crossed the creek, which by that point had swollen fast enough that crossing would have been dangerous for almost anything. But it also never fell behind or moved ahead the way a genuinely spooked animal eventually would, choosing a direction and committing to it. It simply stayed level with us for what felt like hours, close enough at times that I was certain, if the rain let up even slightly, I'd finally see it clearly, and far enough that every time I actually raised my headlamp toward the sound, there was nothing there but wet bark and shifting shadow, the same maddening trick of visibility Caleb Voss described from his own night in those Carolina mountains. Hollis, who'd spent 40 years in that forest and had never once told me he'd seen anything he couldn't explain, finally said quietly, barely audible over the rain, that he thought we should keep the lantern burning at full brightness for the rest of the night, instead of conserving the fuel the way we normally would have on a trip that still had a full day of hiking ahead of it. I didn't need him to explain why. We didn't discuss it directly again until morning. We just kept that lantern burning, sitting shoulder to shoulder under that overhang with our backs against the rock, and we didn't go looking for whatever was on the other bank. And eventually, sometime before dawn, whatever had been keeping pace with us simply wasn't there anymore. The way a feeling of being watched sometimes just lifts on its own, with no clear moment you can point to as the end of it. No final sound or splash to mark its leaving. Just an At first light, with the storm past and the creek running high and brown with runoff, we made our way back up to the ravine where we'd marked the fabric the day before, meeting the full recovery team that had hiked in at dawn. It was in that ravine, below the flagged branch, in a stretch of undergrowth the original search had never reached because it lay just outside the boundary of their search grid, that we found Sadie. I'm not going to describe that part in detail, out of respect for her and for her family, beyond saying that the recovery team's assessment, later confirmed by the medical examiner, was consistent with a fall likely occurring not long after she went missing, followed by years of undisturbed exposure in a location remote enough and difficult enough to access that it made sense nobody had found her sooner. The official cause of death was ruled accidental, consistent with a fall and subsequent exposure. It was, in every way that mattered to the department, and eventually to her family, a closed case. An answer after years of not having one. I drove out to see her mother personally before the department's formal notification went through, because I felt after everything that she deserved to hear it from someone rather than a phone call from an office she'd never spoken to before. It was a long drive, most of an afternoon, and I remember rehearsing what I was going to say the whole way there, and still not feeling ready when I finally pulled into her driveway. She lived a few hours inland, in a small house with a garden Sadie had apparently helped her plant years before any of this happened. Roses mostly, still carefully tended, and when I told her, gently as I could manage, she was quiet for a long moment before she asked me only one question: whether her daughter had suffered. I told her honestly that everything I'd seen suggested it had likely been quick, and I watched something in her shoulders finally loosen, years of not knowing settling into something she could at last begin to carry differently, a visible shift I don't think I'll ever fully forget. A visible shift I don't think I'll ever fully forget. At the small memorial service held a few weeks later, she found me in the crowd afterward, took both my hands in hers, and thanked me, simply and directly, in a way that has stayed with me longer than almost anything else from that whole case. She meant it. I've held on to that memory ever since. But I want to tell you about two things that happened after, because they're the reason this story is the one I chose to tell instead of any of the dozen other cases I've worked in my years out there. The first is the fabric. When the recovery team went back to formally collect and log the scrap Hollis and I had flagged and photographed 2 days earlier, it was gone. Not moved, not disturbed in a way that suggested tampering, simply gone, the branch bare where the flagging tape still hung. Hollis wasn't surprised at all, and his explanation, when I asked, was entirely mundane and almost certainly correct. Black bears in that part of the peninsula will readily take scented fabric, especially anything that's carried human scent for as long as that scrap had, using it as nesting material or simply investigating it out of curiosity before discarding it somewhere we'd likely never find. It happens often enough on searches, he told me, that experienced teams try to collect evidence same day whenever conditions allow, precisely because leaving anything scented overnight in bear country is asking for it to disappear by morning. I believed him completely, and I still do. It's the least mysterious explanation in this entire story, and it happens to be true. The second thing is the boot print, the one recovered near her tent site all those years earlier. That never matched anybody. Once we had a confirmed cause of death, ruled accidental, the department had no further reason to pursue that thread, and officially the file simply notes it as an unidentified print of uncertain relevance, likely belonging to an unregistered hiker passing through the area around the same time. That's probably exactly what it was. Statistically, it's almost certainly what it was, and I want to be fair to that explanation, because unregistered hikers really do pass through popular drainages constantly, leaving prints that never get cross-referenced against anything because there's simply no reason for anyone to look. I have told myself that more times than I can count, and most days, I manage to believe it completely. On the days I don't, I remind myself that the second witness's description, tall figure, dark clothing, silent, was never something I was able to connect to that print in any provable way, and that connecting two unrelated strange details, just because they both make me uneasy, isn't the kind of reasoning I'd accept from anybody else working a case, so I try not to accept it from myself either. I still work that same district today, and I still think about Sadie Lindquist more than I think about most of the cases I've closed in my career. I think about the two witnesses who each swore independently to a different version of the same few minutes on the same trail. Neither of them with any reason to lie, both of them, I believe, telling me exactly what they remembered as clearly and honestly as memory allows. I think about the cadaver dog that refused a fork in the drainage years before anybody had a reason to think there was something worth refusing, and about Hollis telling me, on our long hike back out after everything was finished, that in all his decades of work, that dog's handler had never once seen it refuse a command again. Not before, not after, only that one afternoon, on that one stretch of trail. And I think about that lantern, burning at full brightness through a storm, and the particular quality of the quiet once whatever had been pacing us on the far bank finally moved on. A quiet that felt less like relief and more like something choosing, for reasons I'll never know, to let us be. The case is closed. I want to say that clearly, because it matters, and because Sadie's family deserved that closure and finally got it. A gift I don't take lightly, having been able to give them after so many years of nothing. But closed isn't always the same thing as fully understood, and I've come to accept that some of what I carry out of that job will never quite resolve into an answer. No matter how many times I turn it over on quiet winter afternoons, alone that same back room, with the rest of the boxes still waiting on their shelves. Ranger Kessler still keeps that unmatched boot print record in a folder in her desk, unresolved to this day. Our fourth and final story tonight brings us back to Appalachian country, to the wooded hill country of southeastern Ohio, where local legend has a name for the pale shapes some say still move around the ruins of an old institution deep in the trees. This story comes to us from the ranger who trained the newest member of her crew on the one night she wishes she'd chosen a different assignment. This is Ranger Iris Callahan. My name is Iris Callahan, and I've worked as a law enforcement ranger in Wayne National Forest for the better part of my career. In the hill country of southeastern Ohio, where the terrain rolls in tight, forested ridges instead of the dramatic peaks people usually picture when they think of the Appalachians further south and east. It's quieter country in a lot of ways, less traveled by tourists, which means the rangers who work it tend to know every back road and abandoned homestead site personally, the way you know the furniture in a house you've lived in for years. I grew up not far from the district I eventually came to patrol, in a small town where certain stories got passed down through generations of kids without anybody ever writing them down properly. The kind of stories that live entirely in the telling, changing shape a little each time depending on who's doing the scaring. I want to say plainly before I get any further into this that I came into this job the same way most of my colleagues did, believing those old childhood stories belonged firmly in the category of things you tell around a bonfire and nowhere else. I'd grown up maybe 15 minutes from the stretch of forest I'm about to describe, had heard the same warnings every kid in that county heard about staying away from the old ruins after dark, and had treated all of it, well into my adult life, as exactly the kind of harmless local color that gives a small town its character without meaning anything more than that. I'd even repeated those same warnings myself, half joking, to newer hires over the years, never once expecting to find out firsthand exactly how much truth might be sitting underneath a story I'd always assumed was nothing but a way to keep restless kids close to home after supper. This is the story of the night I finally learned that some of those old stories had more truth buried in them than I'd ever wanted to admit. And about a rookie ranger named Toby Reyes, who I very nearly got hurt worse than he did learning that same hard lesson right alongside me. Toby had been with the district for about 2 months when this happened, fresh out of his academy training. Sharp and capable in most of the ways that matter for the job, but carrying that particular confidence young rangers sometimes have before the woods have had a real chance to humble them. He'd grown up 2 counties over, in a town not so different from my own, and he'd mentioned more than once, half joking, that his own grandmother used to tell a version of the same local legend I'd grown up with. The pale, low shapes said to move through certain patches of forest after dark, always framed as a story meant to keep children from wandering too far from a porch light, rather than anything either of us took. Part of my job as one of the more senior rangers in our small crew was running him through a series of overnight training patrols meant to build his comfort with the district's more remote sections, the kind of terrain that doesn't show up clearly on the maps new hires study before they ever set foot in the field. Toby was a good student. He asked sharp questions, double-checked his gear without being reminded, and had the kind of easy, likable confidence that made him popular with the rest of the crew almost immediately. The sort of new hire everybody quietly hopes will stick around for the long haul, the kind who makes a small, understaffed district feel a little less stretched thin just by being reliably present. I like training him. I want that on the record, because it makes what nearly happened to him that much harder for me to sit with, even now. One of those training routes ran past a stretch of forest most of us simply called the ruins, the remains of a defunct institution that had operated in that area decades before either of us were born. A facility that had housed patients with various conditions until it closed under circumstances that, depending on who in town you asked, ranged from simple budget cuts to something considerably darker. I want to be honest that I chose that particular route for Toby's training partly out of practicality, since it covered ground he needed to learn regardless, and partly, if I'm being fully truthful with you, because some part of me wanted to see whether a rookie's first real overnight out there would turn up anything, the way it always seemed to for me as a younger ranger, before I'd learned the hard way to stop scheduling my own solo and betrayed that the ruins themselves aren't much to look at during daylight. A collapsed brick foundation, most of it swallowed by decades of undergrowth, a rusted iron gate half fallen from its hinges, and scattered concrete footings from outbuildings that had long since been reclaimed by the forest around them, moss thick across every surface, saplings pushing up through cracks in what had once been a courtyard. There's a particular stillness to the place even in broad daylight that I'd noticed myself years earlier, and had always attributed, reasonably enough, to nothing more than the simple weight of an abandoned building slowly being taken back by the woods, the kind of quiet you get at almost any old ruin regardless of its history. Local kids had been sneaking out there for generations to scare each other, spray painting the remaining walls with initials and daring one another to stay past dark, and every couple of years somebody on our crew would have to go pull a group of trespassing teenagers out of there after dark, usually more scared of getting caught by us than of anything the ruins themselves might hold. That history matters to this story, because it gave both Toby and me a perfectly reasonable, mundane explanation ready, and waiting the moment things started going wrong. An explanation that very nearly got us both killed by keeping us in that stretch of forest longer than we should have stayed. We set out in the late afternoon, planning a straightforward overnight loop that would bring us past the ruins around dusk and back to our vehicle sometime before midnight. Nothing especially ambitious. The kind of route meant to build Toby's confidence rather than test it. The first few hours were uneventful in the way most training patrols are, me pointing out landmarks, quizzing him on radio protocol, listening to him talk with real enthusiasm about a fishing trip he had planned for his next days off, describing the exact stretch of river he intended to try in more detail than I probably needed, though I let him talk anyway. Glad for the easy company. I remember thinking, not long before everything changed, that he reminded me of myself at that age, eager in a way the job eventually wears down in all of us, for better and for worse. It was close to dusk when we reached the edge of the ruins, the light going that particular flat gray it does in autumn just before full dark sets in, the wind picking up just enough to send dry leaves scraping across the old foundation stones in a way that made every small sound seem louder than it should have. When I saw the first one, I want to describe this carefully, because unlike some of the accounts you've heard tonight, this wasn't a slow build, not a mystery that crept up over hours or weeks. It was immediate. A small, pale shape, low to the ground, moving quickly between two sections of collapsed foundation wall, gone from view almost as soon as I registered it. There and then simply not there. The way a shadow moves when a cloud crosses the sun, except with none of that natural explanation available to account for it. My first thought, genuinely, was that it was a large animal. Maybe a pale-colored dog that had wandered off from one of the nearby properties, and I nearly said as much out loud to Toby before a second shape followed the first, then a third, moving with a coordinated quickness that didn't match anything I'd have expected from stray dogs, or from any animal native to that forest. They were roughly child-sized, moving low and quick on legs that bent in a way I couldn't quite reconcile with anything I knew, pale enough in that fading light that they seemed almost to glow faintly against the dark brick behind them. Heads disproportionately large in a way that struck me, even in that first frightened glance, as the exact image every version of the old local story had ever described. An image I'd always assumed existed purely as an invention, a shorthand. Scary shape. Toby saw them, too. I want to be clear about that, because it matters for everything that happened afterward. He wasn't imagining things, and he wasn't simply reacting to my own obvious alarm. He saw the same three shapes I did, moving between the same sections of wall. And his first reaction, delivered with the easy confidence of somebody who'd grown up 2 counties overhearing the exact same local legend I had, was to laugh. "Kids," he said, already reaching for his radio to log a probable trespassing incident, his voice easy and unbothered. "Somebody's out here in a get-up trying to scare hikers again. Happens every October around here, right?" I told him I wasn't so sure. He reminded me, not unkindly, that I'd literally briefed him on this exact scenario during our drive out. The local legend, the generations of teenagers sneaking out to the ruins, the fact that our own crew logs had multiple prior incidents of exactly this kind of thing. He wasn't wrong that it had happened before. He also hadn't seen, the way I had, just how quickly and how strangely those three shapes had moved, closer to the darting of something built for that terrain than to any teenager stumbling around in a costume in the near dark. I didn't push the point too hard in the moment, mostly because I genuinely wasn't certain myself, and because some stubborn part of me still wanted the mundane explanation to be the correct one as badly as he did. We decided jointly to continue our patrol as planned, documenting the sighting as a probable trespassing incident the way protocol required, while agreeing to stay alert and stick close together for the rest of the route. In hindsight, that decision, reasonable as it seemed at the time, was the first mistake either of us made that night. There's a woman named Hazel Kirkwood who runs the County Historical Society out of a small building not far from our station. A converted storefront crowded with filing cabinets and framed photographs of the county going back generations. A role she'd held for longer than I'd been alive. And if anybody in that county actually knew the real history behind those ruins, it was her. I drove out to see her the following week, once Toby and I had both had time to think through what we'd seen. And I want to tell you that meeting was nothing like the warm, forthcoming conversations you might expect from a local historian eager to share her research with an interested visitor. Hazel was cagey from the moment I brought it up, closing the folder she'd been working from before I could see what was in it, her hands moving with a quick, practiced motion that told me this wasn't the first time she'd needed to do exactly that in front of somebody asking the wrong questions. And it took a fair amount of careful, patient conversation, most of an hour, before she was willing to tell me anything at all. What she eventually shared, reluctantly and in a voice that stayed low even though we were alone in her office with the door closed, was that the institution had closed following a scandal that never made it into any official record she'd been able to find. Something involving a series of patient deaths in a single terrible winter. Deaths that the facility's own administration had apparently worked hard to keep quiet at the time decades before. She'd spent years trying to track down surviving records, and had found almost nothing, as though the paper trail itself had been deliberately allowed to rot away along with the buildings. Entire ledgers reported destroyed in a fire that, by her own account, several older residents she'd interviewed decades earlier didn't actually remember happening. She told me, flatly, that she didn't have a name for what people sometimes claim to see out there, and that she wasn't in the business of confirming or denying old campfire stories professionally. A historian's caution I understood and respected, even as it frustrated me in the moment. But she also told me in a tone that made clear she meant it as a genuine warning rather than idle advice, leaning forward across her desk to make sure I was looking directly at her when she said it, that if I valued my own safety, I should find a reason to route future patrols around that stretch of forest entirely, and that she had no further guidance to offer beyond that single unambiguous instruction. I asked her directly whether she believed there was something out there, watching her face for any reaction as I said it. She looked at me for a long moment before she answered, turning her wedding ring slowly on her finger the way I noticed she did whenever a question made her uncomfortable. And what she finally said was that she'd stopped asking herself that question decades ago, because the answer, whatever it actually was, had never once changed what she needed to do about it, which was to simply stay away, and that she'd hoped, by keeping her research private rather than publishing any of it formally. That advice, as it turned out, wasn't advice I was free to follow. Departmental policy required a documentation team to formally assess and photograph any reported trespassing site within a set window of time, and my supervisor, reviewing our incident log, scheduled that follow-up for the same stretch of ruins less than 2 weeks later, treating it as routine, which, on paper, it absolutely was. I requested Toby be assigned to accompany me again, partly because I trusted him, and partly because I didn't want to explain, on the record, exactly why I might have preferred otherwise. Before that follow-up patrol, I went back out on my own during full daylight to mark the specific disturbance site where we'd seen movement, flagging a section of ground near the collapsed foundation, where the leaf litter had been unmistakably scuffed and disturbed in a pattern that didn't match foot traffic from any hiker or trespasser I could identify. Small overlapping prints pressed into the softer earth beneath the leaves, close together. I photographed what I could from several angles, crouching low to get the light right, tagged the location with flagging tape tied to a nearby sapling, and planned to bring a proper evidence kit back with the documentation team the following week, satisfied for the first time that I might finally have something concrete to show somebody besides my own account, and Toby's. When I returned with that team, the flagging tape was still there, tied exactly where I'd left it, snapping faintly in the breeze, but the ground beneath it had been completely disturbed, raked smooth by machinery, any trace of those prints gone entirely, nothing left but churned earth and fresh tire ruts from something considerably heavier than a person on foot. It turned out, once I asked around back at the station, growing increasingly frustrated before anybody could give me a straight answer, that a trail maintenance crew clearing storm debris from a nearby section had been rerouted due to a scheduling mix-up nobody had bothered to flag to me directly through that exact stretch of forest 2 days earlier, their equipment scraping the ground clear as part of routine debris clearance that had nothing whatsoever to do with my case. It was an entirely mundane explanation, an internal miscommunication as ordinary as they come. The kind of thing that happens constantly in an agency with more ground to cover than staff to cover it. And I believed it completely, even as it left me without the physical evidence I'd been hoping to bring back for anyone else to see. The follow-up patrol itself, 2 nights later, was the one that nearly went very wrong. We arrived at the ruins a little after dark this time, both of us more alert than we'd been the first visit, Toby carrying himself with noticeably less of his earlier confidence, though he still hadn't fully committed, out loud at least, to believing anything beyond the local teenager explanation, cracking a nervous joke or two on the walk, and that neither of us laughed at very convincingly. We were maybe 20 minutes into documenting the site, me photographing the collapsed foundation wall, while Toby held a light steady for me, both of us working faster than strictly necessary, neither of us saying why, when I heard movement in the brush behind us, Closer than either of us had expected anything to get without our noticing sooner. A dry rustle of leaves that didn't match wind and didn't match anything small. We turned together, and this time there wasn't just one or two shapes at the edge of visibility. There were more than I could count quickly in the dark, moving low along the tree line in a loose, shifting arc that I understood, with a cold drop in my stomach, was slowly closing around the two of us rather than simply passing through. The arc bending inward at both ends, the way a net closes when it's drawn tight. Toby's hand found my arm before either of us said a word, gripping hard enough that I'd have a faint bruise there for days afterward. And whatever remained of his skepticism from 2 weeks earlier evaporated entirely in that instant, replaced by something closer to raw animal alertness than I'd ever seen from him before. We didn't discuss a plan. There wasn't time for one. We started moving back toward the trail that would lead us to our vehicle, quickly but deliberately, both of us keeping our lights up and pointed outward, calling in our position over the radio as calmly as either of us could manage while we walked, my own voice coming out steadier than I actually felt, some old training instinct taking over where panic wanted to. The shapes kept pace with us along both flanks, never rushing directly at us, but never falling back either, hurting us, if I'm honest about how it felt in the moment, along a path that wasn't quite the direct route back to our vehicle, angling us subtly toward rougher terrain instead. A divergence so gradual that I only noticed how far we'd been pushed off course once we were already committed to it. It was on that rougher ground, scrambling down a shallow embankment slick with wet leaves, that Toby went down hard, his ankle twisting beneath him with a crack. I heard clearly even over my own breathing, and the blood pounding in my ears. He didn't cry out, to his enormous credit, biting down on whatever sound wanted to come out, and instead grabbing for my arm to keep from going down further, his face going pale and tight with the kind of pain that steals the breath right out of you. I got him upright, got his arm across my shoulders, and we kept moving, slower now, considerably slower, with him putting as little weight as he could manage on that ankle while I half-dragged him over ground that seemed determined to trip us both at every uneven step, roots and loose stone conspiring against us in a way that felt, in that moment, almost too convenient to be accidental. I won't pretend I got a clear look at any of them during that stretch, moving as fast as we were, focused as completely as I was on simply not letting either of us fall. What I can tell you is that they never closed the distance fully, staying at the edge of what our lights could reach, moving through brush with a rustling, low-to-the-ground quickness that never once slowed to match our own slowed pace, which told me clearly enough that whatever gap remained between us was a choice on their part and not a limitation, a fact that frightened me considerably more than a direct charge would have, because it meant we were being allowed to struggle rather than simply. Backup arrived faster than I had any right to expect. A colleague who'd been running a nearby patrol and heard my radio call, headlights sweeping across the tree line as his truck came down the access road toward the coordinates I'd given. Engine noise and white light cutting through the dark ahead of us like something physically pushing the forest back. I don't know exactly what scattered them in that final stretch, whether it was the light specifically or simply the arrival of a third person and a running engine breaking whatever quiet the ruins had been keeping around us. But the pressure I'd felt along both flanks for the better part of 20 minutes simply lifted. All at once, the same way Nora Kessler described a presence lifting during her own storm. Night out on the peninsula, dramatic final confrontation. Just an absence where a moment. We got Toby into the truck, got him to the hospital for what turned out to be a bad sprain rather than a full break, and I spent most of that drive with my hands shaking on the wheel harder than I wanted him to notice, gripping it tight enough that my knuckles ached the whole way there. I filed a complete, honest incident report afterward, describing exactly what both of us had seen, both nights, in as much clinical professional detail as I could manage without editorializing or speculating, beyond what we'd actually observed. Sitting at my desk until well past midnight, rewriting sections of it, to make sure nothing in my wording could be dismissed as panic, reading it back to myself out. I want to tell you that report was taken seriously and acted on appropriately. What actually happened is that the official incident, once it worked its way up through the district office, was reclassified as a trespassing and vandalism incident involving unidentified juveniles. The same explanation that had covered every prior sighting out there for as long as anybody could remember. Filed and closed within a matter of weeks, my detailed account quietly folded into a single boilerplate line about probable teenage trespass. I understand, from a purely practical standpoint, why that happened. A park administration worried about tourism and liability has very little institutional appetite for a formal record describing something neither identifiable nor explainable, and I don't know that I'd have handled it any differently sitting in my supervisor's chair instead of my own, weighing a public park's reputation against one ranger's insistence on an account nobody higher up particularly wanted to be true. But it means that nothing about what Toby and I experienced out there made it into any official warning that future rangers or future hikers will ever see. The route still appears on training maps without any special notation. A plain dotted line through a plain green patch of forest, exactly like every other trail in the district. New hires still get assigned overnight patrols through that stretch, as a matter of routine. The same way I once assigned one to Toby, without fully understanding what I might be sending him toward. And I've had to sit through more than one training briefing since, describing that section of forest in the same flat, procedural language I once used myself, knowing full well how incomplete it actually was. I've made it my own quiet practice ever since to pull aside every new ranger before their first solo assignment anywhere near those ruins, off the record, away from any paperwork that might one day contradict a superior's version of events, and tell them plainly to treat any movement they see out there as real, whatever explanation eventually gets written down afterward. It's not much. It's certainly not the kind of formal warning I believe the situation actually deserves. But it's the only thing left within my power to do, and I do it every single time, without exception, because I'd rather have an uncomfortable conversation with a rookie than let one of them find out the hard way, the way Toby and I did. Toby's ankle healed within about 6 weeks, and he still works this district today, a considerably less confident and considerably more careful ranger than the one I trained that autumn. And neither of us has ever needed to discuss, out loud, whether we believe the official version of what happened to us. We already know we don't, and some things don't require saying twice between two people who were both there. He still jokes occasionally about that fishing trip he never quite got around to taking that particular season, and I notice every time that neither of us ever brings the conversation back around to the ruins themselves without one of us quietly steering it somewhere else instead, a small unspoken agreement neither of us ever had to actually negotiate out loud. Hazel Kirkwood passed away a couple of years after all this happened, and near the end, when word reached me through a mutual contact at the Historical Society that she'd taken a turn, and likely didn't have much time left, I went to see her one last time, mostly to thank her for the warning I hadn't fully listened to, and to let her know finally exactly how right she'd been. She was frail by then, propped up in a hospital bed in a small room that still somehow smelled faintly of the same old paper and dust as her office. But her mind was sharp right up until the end, and when I told her the whole story, the second sighting, Toby's ankle, the way the department had folded it all into a single line about teenage trespassers, she listened without interrupting one about teenage trespassers. She listened without interrupting once. She told me, in a voice much weaker than the one I remembered from her office, that she was glad I'd survived to come tell her about it, and that as far as she knew, in all her years of quiet research, nobody who'd actually gotten that close and made it out again had ever come back a second time to test their luck further, not once, in all the decades she'd been quietly keeping track, a record she'd kept entirely from memory rather than on paper. She asked me, near the end of that visit, whether I intended to keep working that district, and I told her yes, that somebody needed to be the one warning the next new hire, off the record or not, and she reached over and took my hand for a moment, an unexpectedly firm grip for someone so frail, and told me that was, in her opinion, exactly the right answer, the only answer that had ever done any real good out there. I told her she didn't need to worry about that particular ranger doing so, that I had no intention of testing anybody's luck a second time myself. I meant it completely, and I still do, every single autumn when the leaves start turning, and a new class of rookies comes through the district ready to be trained on ground. They don't yet understand well enough to fear the way they eventually will. Ground that looks, on every map we hand them, exactly like every other quiet, unremarkable trail in the district, giving no hint at all of what actually waits along certain stretches of it. Ranger Callahan still pulls new hires aside before their first solo assignment near those Ohio ruins, off the record, every single time. Our next story takes us about as far from Ohio as this country allows, into the ice fields of Wrangell St. Elias National Park in Alaska, the largest national park in the country, where the rescues don't always end with somebody walking out under their own power, and where the not knowing can last a lot longer than any single night in the woods. This story is told to us by the ranger who flew that search longer than anybody else on the team, and who still flies it once a year out of habit she can't fully explain. This is Ranger Elin Bergstrom. My name is Elin Bergstrom, and I've spent the better part of my career as a backcountry ranger in Wrangell St. Elias, in the eastern interior of Alaska, a park so large that most of the lower 48 states could fit inside its boundaries with room to spare. People hear that statistic and usually laugh, assuming I'm exaggerating for effect. I'm not. It's a park with more glacial ice than almost anywhere else on the continent. Mountain ranges that stack up one behind another until the horizon simply runs out of names for them. And search and rescue operations that can cover more ground in a single incident than some entire national parks contain in total. I want you to understand the scale of the place before I tell you what happened, because scale is the whole reason this story doesn't end the way most of the others you've heard tonight do. I grew up in a small fishing town on the coast, several hours from the nearest edge of the park boundary, and I didn't set foot in the interior until I was well into my 20s, training for this job. I remember the first time a senior ranger flew me over a section of the ice field during orientation. Remember pressing my hand flat against the small plane's window and trying, honestly trying, to make my mind accept the scale of what I was looking at. Mile after mile of crevassed ice folding back on itself under peaks that had never been named because nobody had ever needed to name them. Weather systems visibly forming into salt. It took years of working that terrain before the scale of it stopped actively unsettling me every time I flew over it. And there are still mornings, honestly, when it does again anyway. This is the story of a climber named Priya Anand, and of a search that never closed. Not because we didn't try hard enough, and not because of anything I can point to and call an explanation. It simply never closed, and I've made an uneasy peace with the fact that it probably never will. An uneasy peace, I want to be honest, is still, some years, more uneasy than peaceful. I should tell you a little about the kind of work this job actually involves in a park like this one, because it's different from the ranger work you've heard described tonight in gentler terrain. Most of what I do involves permits, backcountry orientation, checking in with the small number of mountaineers and expedition parties who come through each season attempting routes serious enough to require real technical skill, crampons and ropes, and the kind of judgment that only comes from years on glaciated terrain. It's quieter work than people expect, mostly because the park is simply too vast and too remote for the volume of visitors other parks deal with. Some seasons seeing fewer backcountry permits filed than a busier park might process in a single summer weekend. But when something does go wrong out here, it goes wrong on a scale that matches the landscape, and there is very often no tidy resolution waiting at the end of it, however hard everybody involved works to find one. Priya Anand was an experienced, highly regarded alpinist, the kind of climber other climbers spoke about with genuine respect, rather than the polite deference people sometimes offer inexperienced enthusiasts who show up at a park like this one without fully understanding what the terrain actually demands of them. She'd completed technical routes on 3 continents before she ever filed a permit for our park. And when she and her climbing partner submitted their plan for a demanding, rarely attempted route up a heavily glaciated peak in a remote section of the park, our backcountry office reviewed it carefully, the way we review every serious technical attempt, and found nothing in it that raised particular concern. She was equipped correctly. She'd built in reasonable weather margins. She'd registered a satellite personal locator beacon with the office, standard practice for any technical route that far from any road or maintained trail. The kind of device that, when triggered, sends an automatic distress signal along with GPS coordinates to a monitoring center, which then relays it to us. I met her once briefly, during the permitting process, when she came into the backcountry office in person to go over the route details with me, rather than handling everything by phone or email the way most applicants do. She struck me immediately as somebody who took the mountains seriously, without being humorless about them, cracking a couple of dry jokes about her partner's tendency to overpack even as she walked me through a meticulously planned gear list that left nothing to chance. She asked sharper questions about our crevasse hazard maps than most seasoned guides I'd worked with over the years, wanting to understand not just where the danger was marked, but how recently that data had been updated, and by what method, whether it came from satellite imagery, aerial reconnaissance, or ground reports from earlier expeditions, and how each of those methods might miss something the others would catch. I remember thinking, watching her fold up her printed maps and thank me on her way out, that she was exactly the kind of climber this park could handle safely, careful and skilled in equal measure. I've thought about that conversation more times than I can count in the years since, turning it over, looking for anything in it that might have hinted at what was coming, and finding nothing at all, which is, in its own way, the hardest part of this whole story to sit with. If you'd told me back then that I'd spend years afterward replaying that ordinary, pleasant exchange for some sign of what was coming, I wouldn't have believed you either. That beacon triggered on the 4th day of their planned 6-day route, in the early afternoon, during what the forecast had called a clearing window between 2 weather systems. I want to walk you through exactly what that signal told us and what it didn't, because the gap between those 2 things is the entire shape of this story. A personal locator beacon, once activated, is supposed to transmit a GPS position along with the distress signal, refining that position with each subsequent transmission as the device gets a clearer satellite lock. A process that under normal conditions can narrow an initial rough estimate down to a precision of just a few meters within several minutes. Priya's beacon transmitted an initial rough position, consistent with a stretch of heavily crevassed glacier partway up their intended route, and then, before it could refine that position with a second, more accurate transmission, the signal simply stopped. Battery failure, physical damage to the device, burial under snow or ice, any of those could explain a beacon going silent that fast, and none of them told us anything about what had actually happened to the person carrying it. Her climbing partner, a man named Jonah Webb, had turned back the day before, separately, due to a persistent and worsening cough. He was worried might be developing into something more serious at altitude, a decision he'd made jointly with Priya after they'd discussed it at length. Both of them experienced enough to know that pushing a respiratory concern higher on a technical glacier route was exactly the kind of It's a decision I've come to think about often since, the specific responsibility of 2 skilled partners weighing a small, manageable-seeming symptom against a route that offered no easy way to turn back once committed, and choosing, correctly by every standard the sport recognizes, caution over pride. Priya had continued on alone for one final push toward a high camp before her planned summit attempt, a decision that, again, I want to be clear, was well within her experience level and the kind of call serious alpinists make regularly. Jonah had made it back down to base camp and radioed in her intention to continue solo for that one stretch, exactly as protocol required. When her beacon triggered the following afternoon, he was still at base camp, waiting, and it was his radio call that brought the search to life within the hour. Base camp during those first days had a particular atmosphere I've come to recognize from every serious search I've worked since. A strange combination of intense focus and enforced patience, radios crackling with position updates every 15 minutes, meals eaten standing up between briefings, everybody moving with the specific economy of people who understand that wasted motion costs time. Nobody has to spare. Jonah spent most of those hours at the radio himself, refusing every suggestion that he get some rest, tracking each team's position on a laminated map with a grease pencil, his hand never quite steady enough to draw a clean line. I checked on him periodically, less out of protocol than genuine concern, and found him, more than once, simply staring at that map without moving, as though sheer concentration might rearrange the terrain itself into an answer. We mobilized fast, the way you have to in that terrain, where weather windows close without warning and every hour of delay can mean the difference between a rescue and a recovery. Our team included a bush pilot named Otis Marsh, who'd been flying search and rescue reconnaissance in that park for close to 25 years, and who could read a glacier's surface from the air better than almost anybody alive, spotting crevasse fields and unstable slopes at a glance that would have taken a ground team hours to properly assess. Otis had flown more recoveries than rescues over his career, a fact he never hid from anybody who asked him about the work directly, and he developed over those decades a particular way of talking about the terrain that I came to rely on more than almost any other resource we had. He didn't speak about the ice the way some pilots did, as an adversary or an obstacle. He spoke about it the way you'd speak about a large, unpredictable animal, respectfully, without any illusion that respect alone would ever be enough to guarantee safety. He'd lost friends to that landscape over the years, colleagues and clients both, and he carried that history quietly, without letting it make him overly cautious in ways that would have cost lives on the searches where speed mattered most. Jonah insisted on joining the ground search himself, despite his cough, despite our concerns about his own fitness for the terrain, and I understood why even as I worried about it. I would have done exactly the same thing in his position. The trouble started almost immediately, and it wasn't the kind of trouble either of us expected. I'd assumed, going into that first briefing, that the hardest part of coordinating this search would be logistical, matching available resources to the terrain's demands. Instead, the hardest part turned out to be entirely human, the particular difficulty of two people who both wanted, more than anything, to find Priya alive, arriving at fundamentally different ideas of where to look, each of us certain in our own way that we were right. Jonah was certain, absolutely certain, that Priya's rough beacon position had to be wrong, or at least misleading, because he remembered a specific deep crevasse near their planned high camp route that he was convinced she must have fallen into, a feature he'd photographed on their approach and could describe in exacting detail, down to the particular blue color of the ice at its edges. The beacon's rough position, by contrast, placed her incident somewhat further along the route than that crevasse. In a section of glacier neither of them had reached together. Based on terrain analysis, Otis and I worked through carefully using satellite imagery and the beacon's partial data. Jonah didn't trust that analysis. He trusted his memory of the terrain and his gut instinct about where his partner would have gotten into trouble. And he pushed hard, for the ground search to concentrate on the crevasse he remembered, rather than the sector the beacon data actually suggested. I remember one conversation with him in particular, standing over a spread map at base camp on the first morning of the search, his finger jabbing repeatedly at a spot well short of where our data pointed. "I was standing right there with her," he said, his voice tight with an exhaustion that went well past physical. "I know what that crevasse looked like. I know how close she was working to the edge of it when I turned back. You're telling me a partial GPS ping from a device that might not have even gotten a clean lock is more reliable than that?" I understood the question wasn't really about the data at all. It was about the unbearable idea that the last clear memory he had of his partner, standing safely beside a hazard he could picture in perfect detail, might have nothing to do with what actually happened to her, that the truth might be somewhere entirely outside anything he'd witnessed or could picture. I told him, as gently and as honestly as I could manage, that the beacon data was thin, but that thin data is still data, and that a memory, however vivid, is still just one person's account of a single moment on a route that covered miles of unpredictable terrain over more than a day. He didn't fully accept that. I'm not certain I would have, in his position. I want to be fair to him here, because grief and fear do strange things to a person's certainty, and I've watched that happen to family members and partners on more searches than I can count over the years, in circumstances ranging from minor injuries to the kind of loss nobody ever fully recovers from. He wasn't being difficult for its own sake. He genuinely believed, with his whole heart, that he knew exactly where his partner was, and every hour we spent working the sector, the data actually pointed toward felt, to him, like an hour wasted. An hour she might not have. I understood that. I also had to hold my ground on the terrain analysis, because chasing a hunch in country like that, however sincerely felt, can burn through a search window that doesn't come back. We split our effort in the end, a compromise neither of us was fully happy with. Otis flew reconnaissance passes over both sectors, while our small ground team, Jonah included, worked toward the crevasse he remembered, and I pushed with a second smaller team toward the sector the beacon data actually indicated, a longer and more technically demanding approach that required us to rope up for glacier travel almost immediately. What we found, working that second sector on the second full day of the search, wasn't what either of us had expected, and it's the part of this story that has stayed with me longer than almost anything else in my career. We found a trail of Priya's gear, unmistakably hers, confirmed later against her known equipment list, dropped across a stretch of glacier that made no immediate sense given the terrain. A single glove, first, wedged into a small crack in the ice, easy to miss if you weren't looking carefully, the kind of detail that only caught my partner's eye because a fleck of her glove's bright orange trim happened to catch the low afternoon light at exactly the right angle. Then, roughly 200 yards further along, a broken section of trekking pole, snapped cleanly rather than crushed, consistent with a hard fall rather than any deliberate discarding. Then, further still, a spare headlamp, still functional when we recovered it, batteries intact, sitting upright on the ice as though it had simply been set down rather than dropped. I want to describe what it felt like, finding each of those items in sequence, because it's not something I've fully found the words for even after all this time. Every item felt, in the moment, like it might be the one that finally told us something conclusive, and every item, once we'd examined it, only deepened the uncertainty instead. The spacing between these items and the specific route they traced across the glacier didn't match any plausible fall trajectory, and it didn't match a deliberate cache either, the kind of intentional gear drop a climber might leave to lighten a load during an emergency descent. It matched, more than anything else, the pattern you'd expect from somebody moving in a straight but slightly wandering line across difficult terrain, shedding items one at a time without apparently noticing or stopping to retrieve them, the way exhaustion or altitude sickness or a head injury might cause a person to simply lose track of their own gear without ever fully registering the loss. Otis, once he'd flown a pass over that exact stretch and radioed down his own read on it, agreed that the pattern was consistent with a disoriented survivor moving under her own power for some period after whatever initial incident had triggered her beacon, rather than a single catastrophic fall. That was, in one sense, hopeful information. It meant she might have survived the initial event and kept moving. It also meant we were now searching for a moving target across an enormous stretch of glaciated terrain, rather than a fixed point, which changes a search's entire mathematics in ways that don't favor a quick resolution. We flagged the gear cache carefully, photographed and logged each item's exact position, and made the call, given the technical difficulty of the terrain and the fading light, to leave the site marked for a full documentation past the following morning, rather than risk moving a smaller team through it in deteriorating conditions. I want to walk you through what happened to that site overnight, because it's the one piece of this story with a clean, mundane explanation. And I think it matters to say that plainly rather than let it sit as one more unresolved thread. When we returned the next morning, the entire flagged site was gone, buried under several feet of fresh avalanche debris that had released sometime during the night from a loaded slope directly above where we'd marked the gear. Otis wasn't surprised at all. He'd flagged that exact slope as unstable during his reconnaissance the day before, a classic spring loading pattern he'd seen trigger naturally dozens of times over his career. Warm afternoon temperatures, destabilizing an overloaded snowpack, until gravity simply did what gravity does on a slope that steep. It had nothing to do with our search specifically. It was simply bad luck, a hazard that exists on that terrain independent of anything we were doing, and one that cost us our best physical evidence at exactly the moment we needed it most. I believed his explanation completely, and I still do. It's the least mysterious part of this entire story, and it happens to be true. It was 2 days later, with Jonah's sector having turned up nothing at all near the crevasse he remembered so vividly, that I found myself alone in a whiteout that I still honestly don't fully know how I survived. I'd pushed further into the gear trail sector with a partner from our team, following the general bearing the dropped items suggested, when a weather system the forecast had given us more warning margin on arrived early and hard, visibility dropping from clear to less than an arm's length in the space of maybe 20 minutes. I remember the exact moment it happened. A wall of white, simply rolling across the glacier toward us faster than either of us could react to. Swallowing first the peaks in the distance, then the nearer terrain features, then finally each other, my partner's silhouette dissolving into gray-white nothing less than 10 feet away from me, despite both of us shouting to stay oriented toward each other's voices. My partner and I got separated in that whiteout, each of us following our training, which is to stop moving, dig in, and wait rather than risk blundering into a crevasse trying to find each other in zero visibility. I found myself alone, roped to nothing, on a stretch of glacier I knew, from our earlier mapping, to be heavily crevassed, with no reliable way to navigate beyond compass, bearing, and probe, testing the snow ahead of every single step before committing my weight to it, moving at a pace that felt, in the moment, almost unbearably slow given how little daylight I had left. I want to try to convey what that actually feels like, because it's different from any fear I've experienced anywhere else in this work. There is no landmark. There is no horizon. There is only a small, close sphere of grayish-white around your own body, the sound of your own breathing unnaturally loud inside it, and the constant, grinding awareness that the ground itself might simply open beneath your next step, without any warning at all. I want to describe what happened next as carefully and as honestly as I can, because it's the one detail from that whiteout I've never fully resolved for myself, and because, unlike some of the other stories you've heard tonight, I'm not going to tell you it amounted to anything definite. Somewhere in that stretch, probing my way forward one careful step at a time, I looked up during a brief lull in the blowing snow. One of those strange pockets of near clarity that sometimes open for a few seconds in the middle of a whiteout, and I saw a figure standing motionless on the ice some distance ahead of me, upright, still, facing my direction. I called out. I want to be clear that my very first instinct, in that moment, was hope. The pure, immediate hope that it might be Priya, alive, waiting for help. And I remember the specific shape of that hope, how fast it rose in my chest, before I'd even fully processed what I was looking at. The figure didn't move, didn't respond, didn't do anything at all in the 2 or 3 seconds I had a clear enough line of sight to register it. And then the snow closed back in, thick and total. And when it cleared again, perhaps a minute later, there was nothing there at all, just open ice in every direction. No tracks, No sign that anything had ever stood in that spot. Nothing my probe could find would... I've turned that moment over more times than I can count in the years since. The most likely explanation, and the one I genuinely believe most days, is some combination of altitude, exhaustion, cold, and the particular way a whiteout can trick the human eye into constructing a shape out of nothing. A phenomenon experienced mountaineers have documented for as long as people have been climbing in conditions like that, sometimes called by different names in different mountain cultures around the world. Always describing the submersion of different mountain cultures around. I was hours into a technical solo push, adrenaline and fear doing exactly what adrenaline and fear do to perception under stress. I don't offer this detail as evidence of anything beyond the ordinary strangeness of a human mind under extreme conditions. I only offer it because it happened, exactly as I've described it, and because I've never quite managed to file it away as fully, comfortably explained the way I have almost everything else from that week. I made it to a pre-planned rendezvous point roughly 2 hours after that, navigating the rest of the way by compass and dead reckoning once the whiteout finally began to thin, and Otis, flying a recovery past the moment conditions allowed, spotted my position and radioed down instructions that got me to a safer stretch of glacier before full dark. I want to be honest that I've never been more frightened in my professional life than I was during those 2 hours, and that fear had almost nothing to do with the figure I may or may not have seen. It had everything to do with the raw, simple danger of the terrain itself. A danger that doesn't require anything supernatural to be genuinely lethal. A danger that has claimed careful, experienced people in that park long before Priya, and will very likely claim more after I've retired from this work entirely. My partner, the one I'd been separated from, made it through the same whiteout without incident, having done exactly what our training prescribes, digging into a shallow snow shelter and waiting out the worst of it, rather than attempting to move. And I remember the specific guilty relief I felt reuniting with him back at base camp that evening, aware even then that our two very different responses to the same storm could easily have. Debriefing that night, exhausted in a way that went beyond simple physical fatigue, I gave my account of the whiteout to the rest of the team, including the figure, because withholding it from an official search log felt, to me, like a kind of dishonesty I wasn't willing to commit to a case this serious. Nobody dismissed it outright, and nobody treated it as meaningful evidence either. It went into the log as an unconfirmed visual, logged alongside dozens of other small, ultimately inconclusive details from that search, filed away in the same drawer as everything else we never managed to fully explain. We searched for 11 more days after that, working every sector of the beacon data, the gear trail, and Jonah's own memory could reasonably support, using every resource the park could bring to bear: additional aircraft, additional ground teams flown in from outside the district once word of the search reached them. A specialized crevasse rescue unit that spent 3 full days lowering equipment into the largest accessible crevasses. I want to give you some sense of what that specialized work actually involves, because it's slower and more meticulous than most people picture when they imagine a rescue team searching a crevasse. Each accessible opening had to be assessed first for its own stability before anybody could be lowered into it, since a crevasse's walls can shift and calve without warning, especially with a heavy team working the surface above. Once cleared, a rescuer would descend on rope with a headlamp and a probe, working down through blue ice that narrowed and twisted unpredictably, sometimes opening into hidden chambers large enough to stand in, sometimes narrowing to gaps too tight for a fully equipped person to pass through at all. Each descent took the better part of an hour, between rigging, the descent itself, a careful visual sweep of whatever space opened up below, and the ascent back to the surface. And each one came up empty, the rope team above pulling their colleague back into daylight to report nothing over and over across those 3 days, until even the most experienced members of that unit were visible. I want to give you some sense of what those 11 days actually involved more broadly, because a search on that scale isn't the frantic, continuous effort people sometimes picture. It's methodical to the point of exhaustion, grid after grid, probe line after probe line. Entire days spent covering ground that yields nothing at all, punctuated by the particular, specific ache of finding one more small piece of evidence. A strap, a carabiner that confirms she'd been alive and moving through a stretch of terrain, without narrowing down in any meaningful. We never found Priya Anand. Not her body, not the rest of her gear, not any further trace beyond that single trail of dropped items that simply stopped. As far as we could ever determine, somewhere in a stretch of glacier too heavily crevassed and too geologically active to search completely, terrain where a body could go into a crevasse and simply never be recoverable, swallowed by ice that moves and shifts and closes over itself. Glaciers do occasionally give things back, decades later, as they slowly grind their way down toward their terminus, and every ranger who's worked a park like this one carries some small, private awareness that a discovery could theoretically happen at any point, on any given patrol, years or decades from now, without warning. The search was formally scaled back after those 11 days. Standard procedure once the statistical likelihood of a survivable outcome drops as low as ours had. Though what that meant in practice was simply that the file moved from active search to open case, a status it has held ever since, for years now, without a single new piece of information to move it in either direction, without so much as a rumor or a... I remember the final briefing before we officially stood the search down. A small group of us gathered in the same room where we'd first spread that laminated map across a table days earlier. Nobody quite willing to be the one to say out loud what everybody already understood. That we were choosing an ending point not because we'd found an answer but because the mathematics of continuing had finally run out. Our incident commander said it plainly instead. That we'd done everything the terrain and the evidence allowed us to do. And that closing an active search wasn't the same as giving up on Priya, only an acknowledgement of what the landscape itself had already decided. I've carried that distinction with me on every search I've worked since, the difference between an ending and an answer, and how rarely in country like this we ever get to have both. Jonah Webb never fully forgave himself, as far as I know, for insisting so hard on that crevasse he remembered. Though I want to say plainly, every time I've spoken with him since, that his instinct wasn't unreasonable, and that following the beacon data instead was as much luck as judgment on my part, given how thin that data actually was. He still calls the park office once or twice a year, usually around the anniversary, asking whether anything new has come up. There never is. I've come to recognize his voice on the phone before he even finishes introducing himself, and I've come to dread that particular ring in a way I don't fully know how to explain to people outside this work. The last time we spoke, he told me he'd finally, after years, stopped going back to look at that specific crevasse himself on his own trips through the region, that he'd realized, slowly, that returning to it wasn't bringing him any closer to an answer, only keeping a wound open in a place that would never actually heal it. I didn't know what to say to that beyond telling him I understood, and that I hoped, for his sake, that letting go of that particular spot might make some small difference. I've trained a handful of newer rangers on search protocol in the years since, and there's a particular conversation I have with each of them, usually gently prompted by their own first exposure to an open case file that will likely never close. The specific unsettled feeling of realizing that not every search in this job ends with either a rescue or a recovery, that some of them simply end, administratively, without ending at all in any way that actually... I tell them what I eventually had to learn myself, that a park this size doesn't make any promises about answers, only about effort, and that the difference between those two things is something every ranger who stays in work like this long enough has to make some kind of peace with eventually, on their own terms, in their own times, in their own time. I still fly that sector myself, once a year, usually in early autumn when the light is good and the glacier's surface is at its most legible from the air. looking for anything the ice might have finally given back. A piece of gear, a scrap of fabric, anything at all. Otis still flies with me some years, though he's slowed down considerably since those early days, and we don't talk much during those flights, both of us watching the ice below with the same quiet, practiced attention, neither of us expecting to find anything, and neither of us willing to stop looking just because expecting isn't the same as hoping. There's a particular kind of scanning your eye learns to do over years of these flights, moving methodically across a surface that never quite looks the same twice, the ice shifting and cracking and reforming in ways too slow to notice in any single season but unmistakable if you compare photographs taken a decade apart. I've learned to read that surface the way Otis always could, and some years I catch myself almost hoping I won't find anything at all, because I'm not entirely certain how I'd feel if I did. After everything. I don't have a tidy way to end this story, and I want to be honest with you about that, rather than manufacture a closure that wouldn't be true. There's no fire that kept anything at bay, no light and noise that drove anything off, no body finally recovered to give a grieving family the particular terrible comfort of an answer. There is only an enormous indifferent landscape that took a skilled, careful, experienced climber and never gave any account of what happened to her, and a file in our office that has sat open for longer than some of the newer rangers on my crew have been alive. I think about that figure in the whiteout sometimes, the one I very likely imagined, the one I'll never be able to prove I imagined either. Mostly, though, I think about the simple, enormous fact of the ice itself, ancient and moving and utterly unconcerned with anything human beings need from it, including the need, as basic as breathing, to know what happened to someone we lost. Ranger Bergstrom still flies that same stretch of ice every autumn, watching for whatever the glacier might finally decide to give back. Our next story brings us all the way back down to the wetlands of Louisiana, to a stretch of swamp known as Honey Island, where local families still warn their children, generation after generation, never to follow a light that shouldn't be there. This story comes to us from the wildlife agent who spent one long night learning exactly why that warning has survived so long. This is Agent Colette Thibodeau. My name is Colette Thibodeau, and I've worked as an agent for the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries for the greater part of my entire adult life, patrolling the stretch of wetland around Honey Island Swamp near the Pearl River, close enough to the Mississippi state line that half the families in the parish have relatives on both sides of it. It's different country from some of the swampland further west, tighter in places, thick with old-growth cypress and tupelo, that the loggers never got to be. The earth was too soft and too treacherous to be worth the trouble of hauling equipment through. That toughness is exactly why it stayed wild long enough to keep its stories intact. Some of those stories, I've come to learn, are worth taking more seriously than I ever expected to when I started this job. I was born and raised in this parish myself, the fourth generation of my family to call this stretch of swamp home, and I grew up hearing the same old stories everybody else's grandparents told. Half of them meant to entertain, half of them meant quietly and without ever quite saying so directly, to keep children safe from a landscape that could turn dangerous in ways a young mind couldn't always predict on its own. I want to say plainly that I entered this job, and this particular night, believing myself well past the point of needing those old warnings taken literally. I'd built a career on practical, evidence-based judgment, on reading water levels and animal behavior and weather patterns with the same clear-eyed rigor any trained wildlife agent learns to apply. I didn't think of myself as somebody who still needed her grandmother's warnings. That confidence didn't survive the night I'm about to describe. Not entirely. And I've made a kind of peace with that. This is the story of a night we very nearly lost two people instead of finding the one we went out looking for, and of a piece of local folklore I'd heard my whole life without ever once believing it could apply to me personally. Not until the specific, unforgettable moment it finally did. I should explain a little about the community first, because it matters for how this story unfolds the way it does. The families who live closest to that stretch of swamp have been there for generations. Tight-knit, in the particular way small. Isolated communities tend to be, with traditions that outsiders sometimes find quaint without understanding how much practical wisdom is actually folded into them. One of those traditions is an annual gathering held each autumn, a lantern vigil that's part remembrance and part community celebration. Families gathering at a clearing near the water's edge to light paper lanterns and set them adrift on a slow-moving channel, honoring relatives who passed, sharing food, letting children stay up later than usual, under the excuse of tradition. Long tables get set up along the tree line, covered in dishes every family in the parish takes turns bringing. And somebody always brings a guitar, and the whole evening has a warmth to it that makes the swamp itself feel, for those few hours, like the safest place in the world rather than the genuinely dangerous terrain. It can become the moment anybody wanders past the light of those tables and lanterns. It's a gathering I'd attended most years of my life before I ever wore a badge, and one I still make a point of showing up to every year I'm able, less out of duty than genuine affection for the people who put it together. It was during that vigil 2 years ago now that a young man named Beau Landry disappeared. Beau was 17 at the time, well known throughout the community. The kind of kid everybody had watched grow up. Quick with a joke, a little restless in the way boys that age often are, chafing against a small town that couldn't quite hold his attention the way he seemed to want it held. He worked part-time at his uncle's boat repair shop, talked openly about leaving for the city the moment he finished school, and had, according to his mother, a particular fascination with anything strange or unexplained, the kind of teenager who watched documentaries about cryptids and unsolved mysteries late into the night rather than sleeping, genuinely delighted by the idea that something interesting might exist just outside the ordinary bounds of his small town. That fascination, I've come to believe, made him exactly the wrong kind of person to spot a few follet on a quiet night, curious rather than cautious, drawn toward mystery rather than wary of it. He'd been at the vigil with his mother and several cousins, and according to everybody who spoke with him that evening, he'd been in good spirits. Nothing unusual about his mood or his behavior. Sometime after full dark, while the lanterns were still being set out onto the water, he told his cousins he'd seen a light out past the tree line, off in the deeper part of the swamp, and that he was going to go take a closer look before it disappeared. His cousins, closer to his age than to mine, didn't think much of it at the time. Kids wander off from these gatherings constantly, usually no further than the edge of the parking area to sneak a cigarette or compare phones. Nobody worried, not for the first half hour. And by the time somebody finally went looking for him and came back without him, close to an hour had already passed. Precious time in country like that, once full dark sets in. I was at the vigil myself that night, off duty, and I was pulled into the search within minutes of his mother's first panicked question making its way through the crowd. I want to describe what that moment felt like, because it's different from the way most of the searches you've heard about tonight began. Different in a way that still catches in my chest whenever I let myself remember it too clearly. Even all these years later, even knowing exactly how the night eventually turned out. There was no siren, no dispatch call crackling over a radio. There was simply a mother's voice, rising above the murmur of a peaceful gathering, asking if anybody had seen her son, and the particular immediate hush that fell over dozens of people at once as the shape of what might be happening settled over the whole clearing simultaneously. Plates of food set down half-eaten, conversations dying mid-sentence, every single person present understanding, almost instantly and without needing to be told exactly what that. We mobilized quickly, working off the last confirmed direction anybody had seen Beau walk, a rough bearing toward the deeper stretch of swamp beyond the clearing, into terrain far more treacherous than the well-worn paths most vigil attendees ever wandered. I organized what search capacity we had on hand, a handful of local men who knew the water well enough to navigate it safely by boat, while somebody else called in additional support from the parish sheriff's office and our own department, both of which would take the better part of an hour to actually arrive given how far out from any main road that clearing sat. Bo's mother wanted desperately to join the search herself, and it took 2 of her own sisters holding her back, gently but firmly, reminding her that she'd do her son more good waiting at the clearing to coordinate with responders than stumbling through unfamiliar terrain in the dark herself. It was during those first tense minutes, while we waited on additional support and organized our initial search parties, that an elderly woman named Odile Fabre found me near the water's edge and told me something I've never forgotten. Odile was, without question, the most respected elder in that community, a woman well into her 80s by then, who'd outlived 2 husbands and most of her own generation, and whose memory for the old stories was treated, by everybody who knew her, as something close to an authoritative record rather than mere folklore. She'd raised 6 children in a small house not far from the clearing, buried a son to the same swamp she still lived beside without a trace of resentment toward the water itself, and carried herself with the particular, unhurried authority of somebody who had long since stopped needing to raise her voice to be heard. She took my arm, her grip surprisingly firm for a woman her age, the strength of it startling me even in the middle of everything else happening around us that night, and told me plainly that if Bo had gone chasing a light out past that tree line, we needed to understand exactly what we might be dealing with before anybody else went out after him. She told me about the few follet, a term I'd heard my whole life without ever taking it as seriously as she clearly wanted me to take it that night. Spirit lights, she called them, sometimes said to be the souls of the restless dead, souls that had never received proper rites, wandering the deep swamp because they had nowhere else left to go. Sometimes said to be something older and less easily explained, something that had never been human at all and simply used the shape of a light because it understood better than any person could. She told me the old rule, the one her own grandmother had taught her as a girl, and her grandmother's grandmother before that, passed down with the kind of consistency that made me take it more seriously than I otherwise might have. You would never follow a few follet directly. You never let it become your only point of reference in the dark. The lights, she said, have a way of leading a person steadily away from safe ground and toward the most dangerous water in the swamp, deep channels and soft mud that can swallow a grown man in minutes, all while appearing, the entire time, to be leading that person toward safety, toward a lantern, toward help, toward exactly what a frightened, lost person most wants to see. She told me, too, about her own brother, lost to that same swamp when she was still a young girl. A story she'd never shared with me in all the years I'd known her before that night. Her voice carrying a weight I'd never once heard in it across decades of hearing her tell other, lighter stories at every vigil I could remember attending. He'd gone out checking trot lines one evening and simply never come back. And though the official account, passed down through her own family over the decades, always attributed his loss to a simple drowning, an accident any trapper working that water might have suffered, Odile told me, her voice dropping lower even in the noise and chaos of that clearing, that she'd never fully believed that account herself at something about the specific way he'd been found, far from any water ever. I asked her, as gently as I could manage given the circumstances, whether she believed the lights were something more than swamp gas igniting on its own, a phenomenon I'd studied briefly in a college science course years earlier and understood, at least in theory, to be a real and naturally occurring process in wetland environments like ours. She told me she didn't much care what the lights actually were, only that generations of her own family had learned, sometimes at real cost, exactly how they behaved, and that the behavior itself was the only thing that mattered to somebody trying to bring a lost boy home safely that night. Navigate by what you know, she told me. Compass, known channel markers, the position of the water tower light visible from the clearing on a clear night. Never by what you see moving in the dark that seems to be calling you toward it. It was around this same time that a young man named Dale Presian arrived at the clearing, having heard the commotion from a research camp he'd set up nearby for the season. Dale was a graduate student studying wetland methane emissions, spending several months in the area collecting data on gas production in different sections of the swamp, work that had made him, by his own cheerful admission, something of a minor local celebrity among people curious about the strange lights they'd grown up hearing about, but had never had explained to them by an actual scientist. He'd given a small, informal talk at the parish library earlier that same season, walking a modest crowd through the chemistry of marsh gas combustion with genuine enthusiasm. And I remembered, standing there at the clearing that night, several people mentioning afterward how refreshing it had been to finally get a straight scientific answer about something their grandparents had always treated as unexplainable. He was eager to help with the search, genuinely so, and I want to be fair to him from the outset of this story, because everything that happened later came from a place of real courage rather than recklessness for its own sake. He'd also, predictably, heard the exact same rumor everybody else had heard, that Bo had gone off chasing a light, and he offered almost immediately his own confident explanation for what that light almost certainly was. Marsh gas, he told me. Methane and other gases produced by decomposing vegetation in low-oxygen wetland environments, capable of spontaneously igniting under certain conditions and producing exactly the kind of pale, drifting, will-o'-the-wisp glow that had been spooking people in swamps like ours for as long as people had been living near them. It was, he assured me, a well-documented phenomenon, nothing supernatural about it at all, and he seemed genuinely energized by the prospect of possibly observing and documenting an active occurrence firsthand during the search, an enthusiasm that struck me, even in that tense moment, as a little tone-deaf given what was actually at stake, though I understood it came from scientific excitement rather than any real disregard for... He was, in nearly every other respect, exactly the kind of volunteer any search coordinator would want on hand. Physically fit, calm under pressure, genuinely knowledgeable about the terrain's chemistry and hydrology in ways that had already proven useful on other, less dramatic calls that season, including a water contamination scare earlier, that same summer that his sampling work had helped resolve quickly and correctly. His skepticism about the folklore specifically was, in my experience up to that point, simply the ordinary skepticism of an educated outsider encountering local tradition for the first time. Nothing that had ever struck me as dangerous in itself. And if anything, I'd found his enthusiasm for explaining the science genuinely endearing in the weeks I'd known him before that night. The kind of earnest curiosity that made Popple in the parish warm to him despite his outsider. I paired Dale with myself for practical reasons, rather than any particular concern about his attitude, since he knew the water chemistry and general terrain of that specific research zone better than anybody else available to us on short notice, and because our department protocol favored pairing experience with capable civilian volunteers, rather than sending anybody out alone in terrain that difficult after dark. I want to be honest that some part of me, even then, was uneasy about heading into that particular stretch of swamp with somebody so openly dismissive of the exact warning Odile had just given me. Though I told myself at the time that professional caution and old folklore were two separate things, and that I could hold both in mind without either canceling out the other. We pushed out from the clearing a little after 9 that evening, working a bearing that roughly matched where Beau's cousins had last seen him walking, moving carefully through terrain that shifted, within just a few hundred yards, from the well-maintained paths near the vigil site, into genuine backcountry swamp, cypress knees rising unpredictably out of black water, the footing uncertain in a way that demanded real attention with every single step. Dale talked almost constantly during that first stretch, partly nervous energy and partly I came to understand. His own way of managing the tension of a genuine search rather than the field work he was more accustomed to, describing the gas concentrations he'd measured in different pockets of the swamp over the preceding months, explaining which conditions favored spontaneous ignition, clearly working through his own theory of what Boo might have actually seen. Humidity's right for it tonight, he told me at one point, checking a small handheld sensor clipped to his pack strap. his voice carrying that particular energy people get when a hobby and an emergency happen to overlap unexpectedly. Temperature differential too. If there's decomposition gas pooling anywhere in these lower channels, tonight's exactly the kind of night you'd expect to see it ignite. I told him I understood, and that I hoped for Bo's sake that his theory turned out to be exactly right. Harmless gas and nothing more. The boy simply having wandered further than he meant to, chasing a curiosity that would make for a good story at next year's vigil, rather than anything more serious. Dale nodded, seemingly reassured by the shared goal, even if we clearly still disagreed about the underlying explanation, and we continued on, our headlamps cutting twin cones of light through air thick enough with humidity that each beam seemed almost solid, catching drifting insects and the occasional pale moth in sharp, momentary relief before they vanished back into the dark on either side. About 40 minutes into that search, moving along the edge of a wide, slow channel, we both saw it at the same time. A pale, drifting light, some distance ahead of us, low over the water, moving with a slow, almost deliberate rhythm that immediately made my chest tighten with the specific, complicated fear recognizing something exactly the way it had been described to me. Less than an hour earlier. It was smaller than I'd expected, closer to the size of a lantern flame than any of the larger, more dramatic descriptions I'd half remembered from childhood stories. And its color shifted subtly as we watched, pale yellow-white fading towards something almost blue-green at its edges. A quality of light I'd genuinely never seen produced by any ordinary flame or reflection in all my years working that water. Dale's reaction was instant excitement rather than fear, and I remember him actually gripping my arm, whispering that this was exactly the kind of occurrence he'd been hoping to document all season, that we needed to get closer, carefully, to observe it properly before it dissipated the way these phenomena typically did within a matter of minutes. I told him no. I wanted to be honest that my voice came out sharper than I intended, adrenaline and Odil's warning colliding at once inside me, and I told him we were going to hold our position, check our compass bearing against the known channel markers we'd already passed, and continue on our planned search line rather than diverting toward the light no matter what it turned out to be. He argued with me, not unkindly, but with the genuine frustration of somebody watching what he believed was a rare scientific opportunity slipping away, for reasons he considered, not unreasonably from his perspective, to be superstition getting in the way of good judgment. "It's just gas, Colette," he said, and I remember the specific, patient way he said it, like he was explaining something simple to somebody he genuinely liked, but didn't quite understand. "It's not going to lead anybody anywhere. It doesn't have anywhere to lead anybody. It's a chemical reaction." I held my ground anyway, checking my compass by headlamp, confirming our position against the last channel marker, and telling him plainly that we were continuing on the bearing that matched Bu's actual likely path, rather than chasing anything that happened to be visible off to our side. We continued on that bearing for another 20 minutes, the light occasionally visible at the edge of our vision, sometimes seeming to drift closer, sometimes seeming to recede, always present enough to tug at the edge of my attention, no matter how firmly I tried to keep my focus on the compass and the terrain directly ahead of us. I understood, moving through that stretch, exactly what Odile had meant about the lights leading a person steadily away from safe ground while appearing, the entire time, to offer something like guidance. It took real, active effort to keep my eyes on the compass instead of the light, a discipline that felt, more than once, almost physically difficult to maintain, my whole body seeming to want to turn toward it even as my training and Odile's voice in my memory kept pulling my attention back to the instrument in my hand. It was Dale who finally broke from our planned route, not out of panic, but out of the same scientific conviction that had been building in him the entire hike. He told me quickly that he was going to move just a short distance off our bearing to get a clearer angle on the light with the small gas sensor he'd brought along in his field pack, that he'd stay in shouting distance the whole time, that this was exactly the kind of data he'd spent his whole season trying to capture. I told him not to, told him as firmly as I knew how that whatever the light actually was, the ground surrounding it in a swamp like ours was exactly the kind of terrain that killed people who trusted their eyes over their training. He went anyway, moving quickly off toward a stretch of ground that looked from where I stood, deceptively solid in the dark, flat and grass-covered, in a way that gave no visible hint of the danger underneath. I heard him go down almost immediately, a wet, heavy sound followed by a sharp cry of alarm that had none of his earlier scientific confidence left in it at all. A sound that changed, within seconds, from surprise into genuine rising panic. I found him within a matter of seconds, my headlamp catching him sunk to his waist in soft mud that had looked, from even a short distance away, like ordinary damp ground, the kind of deceptive soft spot that swamp country is full of, and that experienced locals learn to read by subtle changes in vegetation and surface texture, that an outsider, however scientifically trained, simply hasn't. He was already sinking further by the time I reached the edge of that mud, panic making him struggle in exactly the way that makes soft ground like that more dangerous rather than less, his arms flailing for anything solid to grab onto while his own movements worked him deeper with every attempt. I had to talk him through going still, my voice as steady and commanding as I could make it over his own rising panic, telling him to spread his weight as best he could, arms out flat across the surface. Stop kicking. Stop fighting it. While I worked a long, sturdy branch out toward him for leverage, testing my own footing carefully with every step before I trusted my own footing. It took the better part of 10 frightening minutes to get him free, both of us filthy and shaking by the end of it. Dale's earlier enthusiasm entirely replaced by a raw, quiet shock that stayed with him for the rest of that night. And from what I understand, for considerably longer after it. I remember the particular silence that settled over him once we'd finally gotten him onto solid ground, both of us sitting there for a long moment just breathing. Neither of us saying anything at all, the adrenaline draining out of both of us at roughly the same slow pace. The light, for what it's worth, had vanished entirely by the time we'd gotten him free, gone as completely as if it had simply finished whatever it had been doing and moved on to somewhere else, leaving only ordinary darkness and the sound of our own ragged breathing behind it. We continued on our original bearing after that, moving more slowly now given Dale's shaken state, and the mud he was still working out of his boots, both of us quieter than before, the earlier scientific debate between us having gone silent along with everything else. It was perhaps another half-hour later that we found Beau. He was crouched against the base of a large cypress, soaked through and shivering, but alert and, remarkably, entirely uninjured beyond a scraped forearm from an early fall. He told us, once we'd gotten some water into him and wrapped him in the emergency blanket I carried, that he'd followed a light for what felt like a very long time, always seeming just close enough to catch up to, always somehow staying just out of reach no matter how quickly he moved toward it, leading him deeper into terrain he didn't recognize at all, despite having grown up walking these woods his whole life. He said that sometime, he genuinely couldn't say how long into that pursuit, his grandmother's voice had surfaced in his memory, unbidden, repeating almost word for word the same warning Odile had given me at the vigil. A warning, he told us, a little sheepishly, he'd always privately dismissed as exactly the kind of old-fashioned caution teenagers roll their eyes at. Something about hearing it so clearly in his own head, he said, had finally stopped him in his tracks, made him sit down exactly where he was rather than take one more step toward anything he could see moving in the dark. He'd stayed there, by his own account, for what felt like hours, resisting an urge he described as almost physical in its intensity to get up and start moving again toward any light that appeared, until our headlamps finally found him, and he told us, once he'd calmed down enough to really talk, that some part of him had genuinely started to believe nobody was ever going to find him at all, that he'd simply keep sitting there again and started to be with him. I want to tell you about the days that followed, because they matter to how this story actually ends. The morning after we brought both Bio and Dale out safely, I went back with a small team to the stretch of ground where Dale had gone down, partly to formally document the incident for our department's records, and partly, I'll admit, out of my own need to understand exactly what had happened there. We found, a short distance from where Dale had been mired, a patch of reeds and low marsh grass that showed unmistakable signs of scorching, blackened, and curled in a pattern consistent with a brief, localized burn. Exactly the kind of physical trace you'd expect from a genuine gas ignition event. Dale, still limping slightly and clearly exhausted, insisted on coming along despite everybody telling him he'd earned a day of rest, examining the scorch pattern with the same careful, methodical attention he brought to every other piece of data he'd collected that season, snapping photographs from several angles before we'd even finished setting our flags. We photographed it ourselves as well, flagged the location carefully, and planned to bring proper sampling equipment back the following day to document it thoroughly, satisfied at least that we had one small, concrete piece of physical evidence to help make sense of what we'd both witnessed. When we returned the next day, that scorched patch was gone, the reeds standing green and undisturbed as though nothing had ever touched them at all. I want to walk you through the explanation for that, because it's the one part of this story with a clean, mundane answer, and I think it matters to say so plainly. Dale, still shaken but characteristically unable to resist explaining the science even after everything he'd just been through, told me the scorching we'd seen was almost certainly consistent with an extremely minor, short-lived ignition event. The kind that burns for only a few seconds and leaves a residue so faint that overnight tidal movement and the heavy dew common in that part of the swamp would be more than enough to wash away any visible trace within a single day. It wasn't a mystery. It was simple wetland chemistry doing exactly what wetland chemistry does, and I believed him completely, even as the fact that he was the one explaining it, so soon after nearly losing his life to the very phenomenon he was describing, struck me as its own quiet, uncomfortable irony. Bio recovered fully within a matter of days, physically at least, and I understand from his mother that he's more careful these days about wandering off from family gatherings, though she also tells me, with a small, tired laugh, that being 17 doesn't leave much room for lessons to stick as firmly as a worried parent might like. Not at that age, not really, not for anybody's children. He did, for what it's worth, ask Odile herself to tell him the full story a few weeks later, sitting with her on her porch for the better part of an afternoon, while she walked him through everything she'd told me that night at the clearing. And his mother tells me he's never once rolled his eyes at an old warning since, not the way he used to before. A small but genuine change she credits entirely to that unlocked in the swamp. Dale stayed in the area for the remainder of his research season, finishing out his methane study, though I noticed in the weeks that followed a marked change in how he spoke about the local warnings he'd been so quick to dismiss before that night. He never fully abandoned his scientific explanation for the lights themselves, and I don't think he should have, since I believe as much as anybody that the gas explanation is very likely correct as far as it goes. But he stopped entirely, dismissing the accompanying folklore as mere superstition standing in the way of good sense. He told me, near the end of his time there, that he'd come to understand the old warnings as something closer to accumulated field data than fairy tale. Generations of careful observation about how those lights actually behaved, and what following them actually cost. Passed down in a form that happened to sound like folklore because that was simply the most durable way a community without modern data logging equipment had ever found to preserve a genuinely important safety. The official incident report, for what it's worth, describes Dale's near drowning in the mud simply as disorientation in difficult terrain conditions during an active search, which is, strictly speaking, an accurate description as far as it goes, even if it leaves out the specific reason he'd wandered off our planned route in the first place. I've never pushed to have that detail added formally to the record, and Dale himself has never asked me to either. Both of us content, in our own separate ways, To let the paperwork say only what it needs to say while the fuller version lives on in the way these things always have around here. Spoken rather than written, passed carefully from person to person. Some things, I've come to believe, don't need an official file to be properly understood by everybody who actually needs to understand them. I still attend that lantern vigil every year it's held, and I still watch, every single time, for anybody wandering too close to the tree line after full dark. Though I've never again had to organize a real search in the years since. Odile Fabre is still alive as of this telling, well into her 90s now. And she still tells that same story to anybody willing to sit and listen. Her memory for the details as sharp as it was the night she pulled me aside and told me, with a grip I can still feel on my arm sometimes, exactly what I needed to know before I ever set foot past that tree line myself. I've taken to sitting with her for a while at every vigil since, not because I need reminding of the warning anymore, but because I've come to understand, in the years since that night, that stories like hers only survive as long as somebody keeps choosing to actually listen to them, and I intend to keep being one of the people who does. Dale and I have stayed in touch, in the loose, occasional way people who've been through something like that together sometimes do. An email every year or so. An update when his research gets published somewhere. He finished his degree eventually, his methane data from that season forming a solid part of his dissertation. Defended successfully at a university several states away. And he told me once in one of those emails that he still can't fully explain the color of that light to his own satisfaction, that the wavelength didn't quite match anything his instruments had recorded from any of the dozens of smaller, more mundane gas flares he documented over the rest of that season. He's careful these days, whenever he talks about that night publicly, in the rare guest lectures he gives on wetland ecology, to separate the two things clearly. The chemistry he still believes in completely, and the specific, unexplained texture of that one particular night that he stopped trying to force into a tidy scientific box, no matter how much, by his own admission, some part of him still wants to. I don't know, even now, exactly what those lights are. I'm not sure it matters as much as what they do, which is the only thing Odile ever claimed to know for certain, and the only thing I've ever needed to know myself, every time I've gone back out into that swamp since. You don't follow the light. You navigate by what you already know. And you hope, every single time, that whoever you're looking for remembers to do the same thing before it's too late for them to matter.